Thank you. So welcome everyone. Today we're having our fourth technical working group meeting on safety culture, maturity model, and indicators for the proceeding R2110-001. My name is Emma Johnston. I'm an analyst in the Safety Policy Division of the CPUC, and I'll be facilitating this meeting. We're going to start off with just a quick welcome and introduction. So today's meeting will provide an overview of the safety culture maturity model that's been developed for the CPUC, and we'll also hear from the Western Area Power Administration about some of the efforts to integrate safety into the work that they do. As some of you who have gone to the other technical working group meetings have heard me say before, this is the fourth in the series of 4 technical working group meetings that we've had this summer for this proceeding, which was opened in fall of 2021. We'll talk a little bit about next steps after these technical working groups at the end of the meeting, which will include an all-party meeting and a staff workshop on a staff proposal that will integrate all the information that we've talked about in the technical working group meetings to date. So like I said, this is the fourth of 4 technical working group meetings, and the recordings and slides for the other technical working group meetings are available on the Safety Policy Division website. You can also contact me and I can send them to you. The meeting objective for today is to talk about these scoping memo questions, which include what framework mechanisms could be implemented to ensure that safety culture assessments are focused on the-ground results, what outcomes or metrics or indicators should be used to evaluate the efficacy of safety culture assessment process developed within the proceeding, what methodology should be employed in the safety culture assessments to ensure results are comparable across utilities, and should the Commission formally adopt a maturity model to use in safety culture assessments for all electric and gas utilities. Here's a brief overview of our agenda for today. So just wanted to note that we will end at 2, which is a little bit earlier than we had anticipated. Oh, sorry, and one other thing is that there's 2 breaks scheduled. So there's a break scheduled around 10:20 and then also an hour-long lunch break. And then I'm just gonna go over a couple of quick virtual housekeeping slides. So as with the other meetings, the recording and the slides will be distributed to the service list after the proceeding and also posted on the CPUC website. If you have questions as we're going through presentations, feel free to type your questions into the chat as we go or use the raise hand feature, and we'll try and stop our presentations to answer your questions. But we'll also have longer Q&A sessions and discussion sessions throughout the workshop. We'll also follow up to respond to any questions that we can't answer during this meeting. And then we started just on time. We'll try to end on time as well. And note that additional topics will be covered in future meetings. And if you are not familiar with WebEx, this is just a preview of what your screen should look like. So you can see that at the bottom of your screen towards the middle, you have your unmute and mute buttons. So if you're not speaking, try to please make sure that you're muted since this is a virtual meeting. And you can also use the raised hand or chat features to ask your questions. Sometimes your chat gets hidden, but if you press that little like chat box, then you'll be able to see the chat again. And now I'm going to pass it over to Commissioner Houck for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Emma, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the 4th Technical Working Group in Rulemaking 2110-001. I appreciate everyone's participation in these important workshops. I'm looking forward to continuing these discussions. Today, I'm very interested to hear more about the maturity model that our Safety Policy Division and Motive Power have been developing. I want to thank the Commission Safety Policy Division staff and our consultants for all of their work on this proceeding and organizing today's technical working group. Particularly want to call out Emma Johnson for facilitating all 4 of these working groups. And I'd also like to thank Sonia Anderson of the Western Area Power Administration for coordinating with us for their participation in today's working group meeting. So thank you to Ricardo Velarde and Chris Lyles, both from Western Area Power Administration, for joining us today to discuss I cannot talk today, to discuss operationalization of safety outcomes. And again, the goal of today's workshop is to consider how we should monitor, assess, and measure safety outcomes so that we can track improvements over time across utilities. One method of doing so is to use a maturity model to conduct assessments, and that will be what we'll be discussing today. As this is the final technical working group meeting, I want to again thank everyone for their participation throughout the series and look forward to continuing the work and the discussion with all of the parties as we finalize the safety culture assessment process. And with that, I'll conclude my comments and turn the working group back over to Emma.
Thank you, Commissioner Hauk. So our first presentation today is going to be on the safety culture maturity model, and we're going to hear from Rich White from the Safety Policy Division, Dr. Cooper from BSMS, and Duncan Hassel from Motive Power. So I'm going to first pass it over to Rich to start the presentation.
Thank you. About a year or so ago, our group was tasked with implementing a legislative mandate to have safety culture assessments for the utilities. One of the first things we did was to hire Motive Power and BSMS to help us develop a maturity model that we could use in that assessments process. We've also talked to a number of different agencies and consultants who have been using safety culture, have been performing safety culture assessments, the Canadian regulators, regulators within the United States, and so on. And one of the things that's come out is that there are a number of challenges with implementing safety culture assessments in a regulatory environment. So the first thing we want to talk about are some of those challenges that we've identified for a regulator and for entities actually implementing safety culture assessment processes. The second part of the talk is going to be led by Motive Power and BSMS. They're going to get into some of the details of their model, how they assess safety culture, their maturity, and the maturity model associated with that assessment. And then we're going to talk about some recommendations that we think might be a good path forward for the CPUC and the IOUs for implementing safety culture assessments. Next slide, please. So the challenges, safety culture assessment. As I mentioned, we have been talking to a number of different entities, and these challenges have come up over and over again, and we've tried to refine them down to some simple elements. So next slide, please. So the first basic insight about safety culture is that it's an evolving science. There are several different schools of thought, which can essentially be broken down into two groups, a functionalist group and the interpretive group. And the functionalist group is what I think of as really more focused on an engineering culture and the belief that safety culture can be engineered and can be constructed through active management. And it's a process that takes several years. It's a process that requires consistency. It's essentially belief that a safety culture can be changed through management actions, but also assessed on the on the ground. The meat of that is really on the what happens on the ground. The interpretive approach is slightly different. It really looks at what's happening on the ground and tries to understand why those things are happening on the ground. I think they really get to the same thing, but it's really the difference really is in the approach to the modeling. And I think they really do eventually get to the same place, but there's just slightly different approaches. Next slide, please. So the second issue that we've come up against is really how do we mandate safety culture? Culture includes things like behaviors, norms, knowledge and belief. But we've also recognized that safety culture is essentially a public good and that it should be prioritized. It's something that, when utilities have positive safety culture, incidents can go down, major catastrophic events can be reduced, and that's certainly in the public interest. So we have a bit of a quandary of having a culture being regulated, which seems almost very challenging to regulate things like beliefs. Um, so the question is, how can we develop really a culture that is how can we influence this safety culture? Not necessarily mandate it, but what can we do to influence it to make sure it's moving in the right direction? Next slide. So another issue we've also come up against is really defining what safety culture we're assessing. In many of our conversations, we've heard of people focusing on occupational safety culture exclusively, slips, trips, and falls. But at the same time, they're missing things which would lead to more catastrophic events, so sort of the process safety related issues. We've also heard about differences in different units. Some people are focusing on particular segments of their business and not focusing on other segments. Um, I had one conversation where an entity was very proud of what they were doing in their call centers, and call centers certainly can be a place where safety culture exists. The question is, how important is that from a public safety standpoint? So there are a number of things that we want to understand in terms of what is being evaluated safety culture. Can we think about safety culture as a whole for a whole entity? Do we need to look at different business units, regions? There are different commodities, electricity and gas. So there's potentially some benefit in really understanding where you set your focus for safety culture. Next slide, please. Another issue that we've heard about is the scoring paradox, is what I call it, which is that maturity models really create a score. They try and determine a quantitative assessment of where a business is in their safety culture maturity. And this is used essentially to assess and quantify progress. But at the same time, that score can be a little bit of it creates a standard which can be thought of as achieving a goal, which for safety culture is maybe not quite the right way to think about safety culture. We don't think of safety culture as really being a static, singular sort of state. It's really kind of an evolving state of learning and awareness and activity. So it's easy to think about a score saying, well, if we get a 4 on a maturity level score, then we're good. And that would be something that might lead to a check the box approach. And we don't believe that a check the box approach is appropriate for safety culture. We don't believe that we've been developing something that is a check the box approach, but it is something to be aware of and be mindful of as we move forward. Next slide. And then finally, I want to talk about learning and growing safety cultures, because that's I think one of the most important takeaways I've learned in the last year or so is that safety culture really is about developing a learning and questioning mindset, and one that accepts sort of the challenges of learning, accepts sort of issues that come up, and really building in processes that look at problems and try to solve them. And so the learning piece of safety culture, I think, is one of the most important pieces that we have to make sure that we have incorporated in the process. So those are the five challenges that we've identified. I think we addressed them in many levels. When Duncan and Dr. Cooper talk, some of those elements will come up and be a little more clarified a bit. And at the end of the talk, we'll talk about the proposal we have for implementing these safety culture assessments. And I think those proposals, again, address many of these concerns and challenges. So I think, let's go to the next slide. So I think at this point, we can turn it over to Duncan and Dr. Cooper to discuss the safety culture maturity model in more detail.
Thanks, Rich. Good morning, everyone. My name is Duncan Hassel. I'm with Motor Power, and I've been working with BSMS for the past year and a half, and the CPUC team developing the safety culture maturity model. Emma, if we could just pop to the next slide, please. So just want to start with a couple of grounding assumptions. That the proposed model and assessment processes has been developed with the assumption that safety culture is really owned by senior leaders within an organization. And we also want to recognize that each utility is unique, and that the outputs of the assessment can really help utilities identify a set of priorities that align with their business needs, really create kind of a portfolio of options for the IOUs to develop their safety culture. Next slide, please, Emma. So the maturity model comprises 10 functional domains. Each domain is a discrete area of activity that really allows for clear accountability to be assigned within each utility. Across the 10 functional domains, we've defined 5 progressive maturity levels, 1 to 5. The 10 functional domains are maintained through 3 tiers. Tier 1, the top tier, contains the core attributes that reflect the maturity of an organization's safety culture. The purpose of the Tier 1 model is really to quantify the safety culture of a utility. Tier 2 is a deeper dive into each of the functional domains. Each functional domain is described by a discrete maturity model, each one containing a magnitude more attributes than the corresponding Tier 1 model. The purpose of the Tier 2 model is to define really highly actionable best practice that each utility can adopt to grow the maturity of their safety culture. At both Tier 1 and Tier 2, we've grouped attributes within each functional domain to really reinforce how the sophistication of each attribute grows through the maturity levels. We refer to these effectively subcategories as focus areas, and the name for each focus area also really helps to define the scope of the functional domains. And different focus areas have been adopted within Tier 1 and Tier 2. Primarily to allow the Tier 2 models to cover each functional domain in more detail. Tier 3 contains an extensive suite of over 100 indicators to complement Tier 1 and Tier 2. Both leading, lagging, and current indicators have been provided to help quantify past performance and predict future performance. Each indicator in Tier 3 is aligned with Tier 1 and Tier 2. And the purpose of Tier 3 is really to either allow utilities or the CPUC to track the effectiveness of improvement initiatives, or to really help get a deeper dive into the root cause of what is resulting in potentially lower scores in certain areas of the model. Next slide, please, Emma. The fundamentals of business transformation are to know where you are, where you want to go, and how you're going to get there. So we've developed the proposed model to help IOUs create a vision that can be that everyone can agree on, identify and align on priorities, and then develop and execute a strategy and monitor the execution of that strategy, and then iterate this process. So continue to take regular baselines to continue to identify updated priorities and really manage this process over the long term. Next slide, please, Emma. The the model has been developed over the course of the last almost year and a half. It began with a really detailed and thorough review of 30 years or so of safety culture, academic and industrial practice. That process defined the 10 functional domains. We then moved into defining specific attributes. Attributes were based on evidence from academia and industry, and they were then filtered to identify the most representative attributes that were put into the tier 1 model. We went through a process of refining the focus areas and making sure that the attributes were fully aligned to utility industry practice and common language. And went through a series of feedback sessions with the core CPUC team. We then moved into developing the tier 2 models and the tier 3 metrics. A number of the attributes within the tier 2 models were initially identified during that first kind of really broad exercise to identify attributes at tier 1, but were deemed to be kind of more detailed and more representative of best practice than necessarily ideally used for assessment purposes. We then categorized all of the tier 2 attributes into a further set of focus areas, and put together the indicators and aligned the indicators to the tier 1 and tier 2 focus areas. We then went through a calibration process that many folks on this call helped us set up. So again, a further thank you for that. We collected, I think, 10 plus years of safety performance metrics from the utilities. We went through a process to anchor all of those metrics to the utility region that they were reported from, and apply them to a percentile scale. We were then able to identify from that exercise a series of utility staff that we interviewed and effectively conducted a mini maturity assessment through each one of those interviews, and there was something like 60 interviews conducted with a series of folks who were picked based on the regions and relevant roles that they had to safety culture. And then we were able to calculate the correlation between the outcome metrics, the safety performance metrics, and the maturity score as defined by the interviews. Next slide, please, Emma. So I mentioned there's 5 levels of maturity: commencing, coasting, complying, committing, and commanding. The scoring bands have been weighted to better differentiate between progress at the lower end of the scale. So looking at here with commencing, complying, and then coasting being commencing, coasting, and complying being the minimum standard, really. That corresponds to a score in the range of 60 to 80 out of 100. And so you can see from this that to reach the higher levels, it's really necessary to continue to put a significant amount of additional effort in to reach levels 4 and 5 here. But it's much easier to see improvements and recognize growth in safety culture maturity at those lower levels with the greater differentiation. Next slide, please, Anna. So the model has got, as I said before, 10 functional domains that describe safety culture. Major safety catastrophes, such as those that occurred at Chernobyl or on Piper Alpha or Deepwater Horizon, are typically subject to extremely detailed and comprehensive investigations. Their root causes are typically complex and multi-causal and often the result of a series of failures. But it's the research has identified that it is extremely common that these failures begin with decisions and actions taken at the top of a business. Analysis of these failures from the failures of these type and magnitude over the last 50 years has allowed researchers to consolidate around 7 principal areas that are assigned as root cause, and they are profit before safety, just culture, safety leadership, managerial compliance, safety communication, safety competence, and lessons learned. These 7 areas are the foundations of the safety culture maturity model. And with this common theme across the 7 root cause areas of leadership, and to really reinforce the role that leadership plays in the creation of a positive safety culture, we also introduced 3 core business tools: strategy, risk assessment, and corrective and preventative actions, CAPA, to create these 10 functional domains. Next slide, please, Emma. So the next 10 slides will just briefly define each of the 10 domains and highlight the tier 1 and the tier 2 focus areas. We've grouped the attributes within each function to really reinforce how the sophistication of each attribute grows through the maturity levels. And as I said, these subcategories are the focus areas. And again, stressing different focus areas have been identified at tier 1 and tier 2, and through these next 10 slides, you'll just see visually the overlap between how the tier 2 focus areas align with the tier 1 focus areas. So strategy here is focused on the strategic safety culture process that is or isn't in place and used within the utility to advance the overall safety culture. Next slide, please, Emma. Risk assessment is the foundational tool internationally for the excuse me. Risk assessment is really the bedrock of international safety management systems and regulation. Here we're looking at risk as the possibility of harm or loss presented as the existence of perceived threat arising from these situations. Every aspect of operations presents their own threats, and they require formal risk assessments to ensure that no harm is experienced by people or assets. Next slide, please, Emma. Profit before safety is looking at instances where productivity is prioritized over safety, or that safety is viewed as a cost and not an investment. We really advocate for the adoption of a philosophy of safe production that balances the prioritization of safety and productivity as a measure. Next slide, please, Emma. Just culture is looking at the potential for serious issues to remain hidden and be driven underground by those who are looking to potentially avoid sanctions or reprimands from their leaders, co-workers, or the public. Next slide, please, Anne. You'll have heard me stress through these slides multiple times the influence of safety leadership. So this is really looking at the potential for blinkered leadership and corporate culture kind of overlooking the need to identify risks and opportunities, and making the wrong safety decisions at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. This often stems from a lack of knowledge within leadership about their safety responsibilities and the associated accountabilities, or their freedom to act to address safety issues. Next slide, please, Emma. Again, just continuing to really reinforce the role that the senior leaders have to play within the growth of maturity of safety cultures. Something like 80% of the process safety disasters that occur during routine operations can be assigned to managerial compliance. This is really comes down to our leadership making the right decisions at the right time. Next slide, please, Anna. Poor communication is again demonstrated by the research to be a huge contributor in many workplace fatalities. This domain is principally resolved with or principally concerned with resolving the problem of miscommunication, where critical information is not being relayed by decision makers, or the message is diluted as it reached its targeted message. You know, we're really looking at here that a communication that isn't received is not considered a communication. Next slide, please, Emma. Competency failures are highlighted by many inquiries into safety catastrophes. Competence is multidimensional and looks at both cognitive competence, the ability to learn facts and principles, functional competence, the ability to make decisions, plan work, do the work, solve problems, and enabling competence, the ability to lead, to communicate, to interact with others, and to work in a team. Next slide, please, Emma. Lessons learned looks at situations where critical safety information was not extracted from near miss or adverse events, and where it wasn't shared in a timely manner or wasn't shared at all. So to be termed a lesson, there must be an observable and measurable positive impact in the behaviors associated with the lesson that can be used to improve performance in a predefined way. Next slide, please, Emma. And then the final of the 10th functional domain is corrective and preventative actions, or CAPA. This really refers to the organizational actions required to rectify or eliminate potential future adverse events. Corrective actions are aimed at adverse events that have already happened, and preventative actions are aimed at reducing the potential for an adverse event to occur. This links back to risk assessment and the potential identification of the identification of a potential incident and or a root cause analysis of an incident. CAPA systems are a key component to continuous improvement. Next slide, please, Emma. We've defined an assessment process that can be undertaken either by an independent third party or undertaken as a self-assessment by the utilities with a subsequent audit. At a high level, it comprises a series of focus groups followed by document analysis and interviews. The focus groups are to be principally attended by a representative cross-section of senior leadership, supplemented by middle management and other relevant employees. Again, really continuing to stress that point of senior leaders owning the safety culture within their utilities. Each focus group, and we expect something for the bigger utilities here, we expect something in the region of 150 attendees across all of the focus groups. They would be facilitated as an interactive session where the groups of attendees would rate their organization on the maturity of its safety culture using the model that is described in the report that will be issued as part of this proceeding. Maturity levels will be assigned to each focus area and ultimately rolled up to a maturity level for the function, and can also be rolled up as an overall maturity. For each focus area and the level that the attendees assign, they'll be required to cite documentary evidence of the assigned maturity level. And then following the focus group areas, the assessors, and again, be that internal or external assessors, would conduct a detailed review of the documentation cited as evidence for the maturity score within each functional area. The objective of this phase is to ensure that the executives and leaders are representing processes and actions that are clearly documented and represent the as-is state of their organization, and they're not biasing their maturity level based on an aspirational future state. The third phase of the assessment, leveraging the maturity model, is a series of one-on-one or group interviews The objective of these interviews is to validate the processes cited within the focus group. So we're looking at what people think happens, what is written down as happening, and then what the day-to-day experience of utility employees is of these relevant processes. With solid planning and competent assessors, again, internal or external, and full cooperation from across the organization, we think the maturity model assessment can be completed in 4 to 6 weeks. This assessment will create a really clear audit trail, giving the utilities the opportunity to conduct these self-assessments that can be easily accepted and broadly trusted by the regulator and the public. Next slide, please, Emma. So I indicated earlier, we did quite a lot of work to assess the reliability of the model. We're confident that the 10 functional domains comprehensively cover the known causes of safety catastrophes over the last 30 to 50 years. We've also demonstrated through this calibration process that the model to be the first known safety culture maturity model with concurrent validity, and that really allows us to draw actionable conclusions from the data. And I'm sure we'll ask Dr. Cooper to speak a little bit more about this process afterwards. But just at the very highest level, we took the safety performance metrics that I described earlier. We cleaned them and anchored them to regions, and set the regions on a percentile score. We then conducted a series of interviews, and highlighting here the roles that we interviewed. So looking at a priority 1, inspection and maintenance staff, asset owners and construction managers, and then as a priority 2, regional health and safety managers, asset management leaders, and operations staff. And we selected, or the utilities helped us select effectively a cross section of staff across the region. So we had a balance of the utilities and regions, and a comprehensive set of these groups of roles and responsibilities. We then, within the interviews, 10 questions that were derived from the maturity model functional domains were asked, and each region, based on the 2 interviews that were conducted within each region, was assigned a safety culture maturity score. And what we were able to demonstrate that between looking at a calibration or a correlation of the safety performance metrics and the maturity scores as assigned from the interview data, we were able to recognize that we had statistically adequate reliability and a negative correlation, which is a really good thing, of negative 0.72, where the metrics and interviews related to personal safety metrics. The findings were a bit more complex for the process safety side of things, principally because a number of the process safety metrics that are measured by the utilities actually have a large component of issues that are outside of their control, but certainly creates an opportunity for kind of collectively the CPUC and California utilities to really derive an improved set of process safety metrics that could really move the industry forward. Next slide, please, Emma. So just wrapping up this section, looking at the maturity model, we wanted to acknowledge that there's a parallel path of safety culture being pursued by OEIS. This was derived from work done by BCG and engaged by, it was the Wildfire Safety Division at the time of the CPUC in 2020. BCG developed 5 tools for WSP, now OEIS. They were looking at the wildfire mitigation plan guidelines, utility wildfire maturity model and assessment, utility survey, the wildfire mitigation plan metrics, and a supplemental data request. The the maturity model that was developed by BCG was very focused on the very technical aspects of wildfire mitigation. So there really isn't any overlap between this maturity model and the maturity model that we've developed. And then the utility survey, and Emma, if you just move it forward so we bring up the next set of boxes. We've also mapped the utility assessment comprised an employee survey and a utility self-assessment. The employee survey was a measure, was really a measure of what we term safety climate, as indicated by the use of a Likert scale. So running from strongly agree to strongly disagree, scale of 1 to 5. I'm sure you've all seen. Safety climate is really a measure of sentiment in the moment, and research tells us that it's known to be highly variable. We've mapped both the employee survey and the self-assessment to the 10 functional domains in our maturity model, and you can see here in the boxes on the right-hand side that we have a degree of overlap, but we've clearly identified a number of unique areas that our maturity model covers. That's my section wrapped up.
Yeah. So I think we're running a bit ahead of schedule. I'm wondering if it makes sense to open it up to questions on the maturity model at this point. What do you think, Emma?
Yeah, we can do that. We have for this section of the workshop before the first break, we have until I think 10:10. We have about 30 minutes to do the slides and questions.
Okay. Should we open it up to questions for folks on who have any specific questions or general questions on the Motive Power BSMS maturity model? I think Paul Schulman raised his hand.
Go for it, Paul.
Okay, yeah, I have a little confusion about the functional domains. I don't know if it's possible for you to go back and put up the initial slide about the 10 functional domains. Thank you. First, these domains are a hodgepodge of things with different specificities, and some of them have significant overlap. So I don't understand how you would actually try to assess each one separately in the cases of overlap. You know, risk assessment is a very specific process. Corrective actions are specific programs. Just culture is a concept that has been very broadly defined. It's not just, you know, not punishing people for reporting stuff. If you look at Sidney Decker's book on that, you see just culture is in a sense, a summary concept about a culture itself. And then some of these things, the just culture includes safety leadership, and safety leadership also includes communication. And so a corrective action program is a communication program in many respects, and it bears on the processes of safety communication. So I guess I'm rather confused here about and the other thing is profit before safety is not a function. You really hope it to be safety before profit. Well, I don't know why you have it called profit before safety, which is something you actually don't want to have in an organization. And anyway, it just seems to me that these are very incomparable in many respects and differential ideas, and I don't understand how they translate into a set of comparable dimensions that you can actually separately analyze.
Oh, I think that's yours.
Go ahead. Oh.
Yeah, I figured that was for mine. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Dr. Schulman. Great questions. Great comments because it allows me to state quite clearly that the 7 broken safety cultures, they are discrete, but they are interlinked. We know they are interlinked. So the point you're making where there are links between them all, we don't have a problem with. We know that. And that was when we were going through the development process that Duncan was talking about, where we started off very, very, very broad. Then we went down through, it's almost like when you develop your hypothesis, you have a field and then you come back down on like a funnel, okay? So if you keep that funnel in your mind, we've gone all the way through. So when we look at leadership, we say, well, what are those key attributes? What is it that we should be focusing on at a T1 level? So you can go, for example, to the Deepwater Horizon report, and you will find lack of accountability, lack of responsibility, people unclear about their freedom to act without having to report to a senior manager and asking permission. And I can think of in Britain, North Sea, when I was just beginning to get into the safety, where the Piper Alpha burned and the guys were being killed much more because they were waiting for permission from managers from the beach to be able to cut off the flow of oil that was feeding the fires. So that's what it's addressing, is that freedom to act. And then we find out that there's a lot of leaders who have no knowledge of safety per se. And I mean, there's stuff I know that I can't really say, but I can tell you there are people in very senior positions who have responsibility for particular functions who have no knowledge of the domain of which they're responsible for. So when it comes to the knowledge of safety, that's a really key piece. And again, what we have done throughout this process, and I would very much welcome your comments on the report that will be finally issued. But when we go back and we compared this to 12 other maturity models, so each of these 7 broken safety cultures and the core business tools also appear in other maturity models. They're there that other researchers have found, from like the British HSE, the rail boards, and so on and so forth, even the IAEA. Then when we go through and we went through the documentation linked to these proceedings that the IOUs had provided, and we discovered that each of these topics is referenced in their documentation. We then went back to the WSD's requirements for this, and we find out that the only one that didn't appear in the requirements was competency. And then later on, we're going to talk about indicators. And when we look at all the indicators from the different working groups and the works that have been done, these topics keep coming up. When we go back to one of the workshops, which was the 2EC workshop, the SEMPRA, they did the interpretive approach, and they came up with 10 recommendations or 10 findings for the IOUs. Their 10 findings mapped onto these topics 100%. So I think if we can recognize there are links and interlinked, they are links, they certainly are. That would be stage 1. Step 2 would be to acknowledge and understand that these are common across from different places. If you look at the EU studies for loss of primary containment studies, for example, Alicio Canyon, the attributes are there. It's the same domains again. So I think the domains are very robust and can be found everywhere. The questions about how unique they are is a slightly different issue. But what we did try and do was, through our, if you imagine the funnel, but like a hypothesis, we've tried to focus at tier 1 on the core features, because we could have had numerous features in it. But we wanted to try and get the measure to focus on what are the key aspects of each of these domains, which we think we've succeeded with. And certainly when we did the interviews, and the interviews and the responses were coming back, each of these functional domains and the criteria within in the focus group, so we've got focus areas, and within a focus area there's further criteria, they were covered 100% across all of the interviews as a whole. These things were covered. So we know that we're in the right area for the IOUs. The points you make about just culture is a very interesting one. Originally, this was a culture of fear, and it was renamed so it was more positive to reflect a just culture. And yes, it takes in blame. When we did the research on this in North America for the conglomerate, we discovered that the culture of fear, using multiple regression techniques, loaded on 7 times onto the basket of indicators that we use there. So we know it's a key area and it's a key feature. We try to separate out the just culture piece, the justice, from the blame, and again, and I don't really want to kind of talk too much about this, but suffice to say that they did both appear in through the interview process, and they both had different levels of maturity. So the measure itself has proven to be very much on point. And I think I would ask you perhaps to read the report and then make comment on about how you're confused. And I think that at this stage would probably be very helpful. And I'm sure you'd make some very useful comments too.
Thanks, Dr. Cooper. So we have one question in the chat, or actually a couple of questions in the chat now. Bob Coleman, would you like me to read your question out for you, or do you want to come off mute to ask your question?
I can ask the question, that's fine. My question was that Duncan, as you were explaining it, and you did a very good job, you said that the cultural assessment was highly affected by sentiment in the moment. And I wondered, when it comes to a safety cultural assessment, would it be dramatically affected in a negative way right after an event? And could it possibly be very good just prior to an event? And if that's the case, is measuring safety culture based on this high variability, as you put it, an effective practice, or is it based highly on subjectivity and less objectivity?
I'll take a first pass, and Don, if you want to add some detail. Bob, thanks for the question. I think just clarify my understanding that the reference to a measure of sentiment in the moment was in relation to safety climate, which is effectively the employee survey that's been developed by OEIS. And so the work that we've put forward is more, we believe, a measure of safety culture. So it's very much our position to advocate for a measure of safety culture, not a measure of safety climate.
So if I could follow on from that, the way that the assessment would be done is and I've been doing this in various parts of the globe, is we would ask for a focus group exercise where we would ask for 50 or so people to attend. Those 50 or so people would be divided into tables of 5 or 6 people. And then the data is presented, and please can you assess these criteria where you think you are according to these criteria in this functional domain. And so there's a conversation held around the table. In other words, it's a group rating, it's not an individual rating. So in terms of sentiment in the moment, it's lessened. The biases from asking individuals to rate something is much less. So, and we've tried to build into the scoring that if there's disagreement within that group of 5 people, then the default is to take the lowest rating and use that as the rating. We would also ask for evidence, give us objective evidence to support this rating that you've just made. And that's then where the triangulation or the triage measures, or the same measures they use in the interpretive approach, which is where we would then default back to the on-site observations, the document analysis, and the interviews to verify the evidence that's been provided by each group of 5 people to make sure that that supports their ratings or not. So we've tried to build in an evidence-based trail. The question of whether prior to an incident you're going to get a good rating and immediately after you're going to get a negative rating, it's certainly possible. Psychology tells us that's possible. After a negative event, people look at the world in a slightly different lens, and you could see that when the Deepwater Horizon happened, everyone was quite happy. And I think, in fact, they did a pulse survey on the Deepwater Horizon about 6 or 7 weeks prior, which was a survey. It didn't pick up the issues that were involved. And then afterwards, there was a lot of angst about whether you're drilling into deep water, whether you're drilling down to these things. And ExxonMobil, sorry, just prior to that, had a kick, hadn't followed through, they'd abandoned the well, and BP didn't. So again, there's different cultures at play and different things going on in the organisation. So I would imagine, yes, in answer to your question of sentiment in terms of before and after, yes, there would be a difference. Will our measure pick it up? I don't know. We haven't had the opportunity yet to be able to use it in the field for real. And until such time as we can do that and we begin to get our data stream coming in, then there's some of these questions that we just cannot answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Sarah Lee asked a question for transparency. Could the statistical model underlying the peer framework and the results of the calibration be put in the concept paper for the 3rd and 4th technical working group? I don't know that I can answer that on the spot, but we will either, I think that sounds like a reasonable request, so we will either do that or release it separately, depending on the timing of those events. And we have a couple more questions, and we will need to get to the last part of the presentation probably by around 10:05. I'm going to pass it to Jason. You have your hand raised, and then we'll do Amanda's question, and then we'll move on to the presentation.
Thank you.
So
And really appreciate all of the added detail here, and very much looking forward to seeing the more detailed report. The question I had is, it was on one of the last slides, there was a mention of actionable conclusions being drawn from the data. And my question is, what will the outputs of the pure model look like? Will it be a numerical rating, or will it be some sort of qualitative description of what was observed? And I guess what I'm trying to get a better sense of is how will the resultant data, the outputs from the model, kind of help guide learning and improvement activities going forward. And maybe some of that's in the report, but just want to get a sense of what the results will look like and how that will inform efforts going forward.
I can take a first pass at that. Thanks, Jason. I think the easy response is yes to everything. We anticipate extremely detailed results being available from this. Obviously, principally driven by whether it is a self-assessment or an external independent assessment, but the level of detail within each of the tier 1 maturity model, singular, and then the 10 tier 2 maturity models, there's tier 1 is effectively a 5 by 10 matrix with 3 to 5 attributes defined within each box. My mental arithmetic is no longer good enough to tell you how many attributes that is at tier 1 anymore. And then tier 2 is effectively 10 of those tier 1 models. So there's a huge number of very detailed attributes that we effectively expect to be reported as either present or absent. And so fundamentally, the output, we would expect the output to be framed as a series of priorities, both at the there is the potential to have an overall a singular safety culture score, and then a safety culture score within within each of the functional domains, and then within each of the focus areas. And so what the utility could then do is, identify within those focus areas where they wanted to prioritize improvements, and then either spin up improvement initiatives or deploy some of the corresponding tier 3 metrics, and collect even more detailed data around what the root cause could be. Each one of the T3 metrics is aligned to a T1 and T2 focus area. So they're really a tool for the utilities to track the progress of improvement initiatives, or to dive even more deeply into the root cause of some of the lower scores. And we really hope that I'm a big portfolio management guy. That is a real passion of mine, and we've focused very hard on creating outputs that will feed into existing portfolios of improvement work that we know the utilities do, that we've heard about across the prior 3 working groups, and hopefully really just create a structure in which to drive a portfolio of safety culture improvements over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I'd like to make a quick comment on that as well. It's something that the kind of the output and what it looks like for the utilities is, and the commission, has been something we've talked about, but it goes back to kind of Paul Schumann's comment that these functional domains are really interrelated with each other. So it makes it very challenging to say, here's the result. Because, when you have a result that's dependent on other domains in some way, it becomes a bit of a challenge to say, is this good or is this bad, or so on. And so I think Duncan is right, is that the result is really kind of a snapshot of probably not a snapshot, of maybe not the right word, but it's kind of a view of the portfolio. And it's a view of everything that's within the domain of the utility and the actions that it can take. And so I think it's a really more holistic view. And so we do need to work out some of the issues about how do we report that portfolio in a way that's meaningful and actionable.
Thanks, Rich. So the last question that we have here is, will the CPUC specify the requirements behind the 10 domains and how we will be measured during an assessment in their proposal, from Amanda? I think to an extent, Rich, your presentation might cover some of this, and then the additional details would be released within the staff proposal that's going to be released in the fall. But Rich, if you want to, or others, if you want to answer this briefly, then we could do that. And then Rich, we can move on to your presentation.
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at that. I think that so the way the model is set up, there's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And so each of those levels has a certain degree of specificity. We're looking at doing kind of 2 sets of assessment. One is a comprehensive assessment, which meets the legislative requirement of having a independent third-party assessment at least every 5 years. That one we anticipate being quite robust and looking at a variety of things that would be perhaps a whole comprehensive set of indicators that are shown in the tier 3 level of the model. So that could be a very robust assessment. For the self-assessment for the utilities, that again is, the key word is self-assessment. And that would be, in my view, something that the utilities would determine what makes the best set of things to assess during their own self-assessment. It might also make sense for us to think about a minimum set of things to report, but again, I think that's something that's to be determined. So I guess I'll jump into the next set of slides on what we're proposing to be a structure for implementing the safety culture assessment process. If you can go to the next slide, please, Emma. So as we've talked about, we believe that each IOU is really the owner of its own safety culture. And we want to be really respectful of that. We don't believe that the CPUC or any regulatory body can just mandate what a safety culture should be. But at the same time, safety culture is also something like a public good. If a catastrophic event happens, then people in the public can have consequences. So there is a public good element to that as well. At the same time, as Dr. Schulman pointed out, and Dr. Cooper points out, there are known safety culture, as Dr. Cooper calls broken safety cultures. And these are known to be things that are behind catastrophic events. But as Professor Schulman points out, a lot of these things are interrelated. And that's not really clear how they're interrelated. And I think one of the things in the interpretive school, that's one of their issues with the functionalist approach, is that it's essentially too simplistic, is I think what some of the interpretive folks would say, is that all these interrelations make for a little bit more messy situation and a little more difficult to really assess just simply along essentially a linear set of domains. I don't think that's quite what this maturity model does. Again, as we've talked about the portfolio of issues, I think this model is assessing a portfolio of issues, and that's kind of a blended approach. And lastly, fundamental assumption is sort of that learning and engagement is really important to really developing a safety culture. So we've tried to develop a process that kind of is aligned with these basic assumptions about where we are in the safety culture science. If you can go to the next slide, please. So what we've decided to do is to propose this 4-year cycle. And in the first year, we think about having a comprehensive assessment. And this would be where an independent third party comes in and does the assessment of using the pure model, perhaps at the tier 3 level, so getting into very detailed assessment of activities and multiple levels of an organization. As we go forward, we want to look at also include the ability to recalibrate and update the model going forward, because we do recognize that the model is still a part of a learning process itself. The science is still a bit immature, and we think that improvements will be needed and appropriate going forward. So we also want to have a point where we update that model based on assessments. And then in the intervening 3 years, the utility itself would actually do its own self-assessment using this maturity model again. So again, sort of the same standard, looking at the same domains, assessing along those same domains, using the same kind of assessment methodologies. So we can compare apples to apples. What are the utilities assessing for themselves, and what does a comprehensive assessment do? And then continuing that loop. So there's a bit of a check on the utilities self-assessment process, and also a check on the model performance itself. Next slide, please. So in a timeline, this would look something like this, where there's a comprehensive, on the top of the timeline would be the third-party assessments, and below the timeline would be the utility-driven assessments. The comprehensive assessment in the first year, we'd probably do some comprehensive assessment just to get started. And the utilities could use that assessment as their baseline assessment as well as a startup. But we also think it's really important that as we were talking, what do these reports look like? We also think it's very important that the IOUs do some sort of evaluation of the report and come up with an action plan, and come up with a set of priorities and develop an action plan to implement those priorities. And we're proposing that the IOUs then report their assessment and their action plan to the PUC on a yearly basis. This would provide kind of a public view of not only the self-assessment that the utilities make, but also of their prioritization and their plans. And this would occur every year. Utilities would do a self-assessment each year, develop a new set of priorities, and develop a new set of plans and report to the PUC. So we'd have an ongoing list of actions taken by assessments taken by the utilities and actions taken by the utilities, and some assessment of whether those actions have been successful, since we're building up a set of self-assessments over time. And then on the fourth year, we do another comprehensive assessment by an independent consultant that would look not only at the utilities assessment over the past 4 years, but do another independent assessment, and also evaluate the model itself to identify potential gaps. If we can go to the next slide. So we think that the comprehensive assessment will take approximately 6 months. Again, this would be a very in-depth review. We'd probably do more focus groups, more interviews, a broader set of employees and contractors that may be involved with the utility. So, and in addition to that, there's also a gap analysis that will help us identify things that would be blind spots that maybe the utilities missed or that the model itself missed. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, the comprehensive assessment really has three components. One is an audit of the self-assessments. So that is a review of the IOU self-assessments to see how well they did. And then another assessment itself that's independent. So there would be two things. One is how did the utilities rate themselves? And then two, an independent assessment. And then the next piece is the gap analysis to understand, one, were there gaps between the comprehensive 4-year assessment and the IOU's assessment? Did the IOUs miss anything? In addition to that, the gap analysis would also look at gaps in the model. Were there things in the model that were not adequately addressed? Were there overlaps? Were there certain things that were double counted, as Dr. Schulman said, there were sort of overlaps? Or do those overlaps indicate that there are things that were missing in the model? So again, we're looking for things that may have been missed in the model, things that may have been missed in the assessment process, and just also inaccuracies that may have been made in the self-assessment process. And that would lead to a report, a comprehensive assessment summary report, which would be reported to the commission. And finally, again, there's that model recalibration piece. What did we learn about the modeling process? Not only the model elements, but also the self-assessment process. And that would lead to an updated model that would be passed back to the utilities for their use in the next cycle. So we're trying to incorporate a bit of a learning model into this, not only for the utilities, but also for the modeling process itself. Next slide, please. And again, I think I've talked a bit about this self-assessment process. This one is the utilities are really focused on driving their own process, but they would be using the pure model as a basis for the assessment. this allows us to really use the same language. We're talking about the same functional domains. We have this understanding of the best practices of those domains, essentially the tier 2 level. And so it creates a good basis for us to have a common language going forward. Next slide, please. And finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the inputs to this model. As we mentioned before, there are a number of focus groups and interviews. There's a document collection that's used to verify and validate the assessments. Additionally, there's also information that can come from other sources, such as the safety climate surveys that might be happening in OEIS, other sort of safety management system audits that could also be occurring. Again, integration of that information into the pure model is a bit of a work in progress, but we believe that there is an ability for us to kind of essentially cross-check and validate some of the other data collection processes that are going in parallel to this safety culture assessment process. And let's see. And so I think that completes my part of the talk. I'd be happy to open it up for questions or comments. So
we can probably take one question if someone has one, and any of the questions that we don't get to, we can address at a later part of the working group meeting. Dr. Schulman.
Yeah, I think I have a question about the role of the comprehensive assessment in the first year. And it's a question based on another question, but I believe that Duncan said something about looking at the attributes, and basically he said it's just determining basically whether they're present or absent. And so the question to that is, are you saying that would be, in a sense, a nominal binary variable, yes, no, and that would be it? And the reason I ask that question is I worry a little about the use of the comprehensive model as the basic starting point, background level. And I think, Rich, you said utilities in the first year would probably accept the comprehensive model as their self-assessment. But I wonder about that. And I wonder about I worry a little about models getting institutionalized, even though they're supposed to be part of a 4-year cycle with revisions. And so the question, maybe it all devolves into a suggestion. It seems to me it would be very helpful in the first year for those attribute assessments not just to be yes or no, or even a number, but to write, in addition, a little narrative for the utility. Here's what we see. We're not sure about this exactly, but we see some stuff, but it's a little troublesome, etc., just so they get a better feedback about that assessment instead of having it put there as a kind of starting point there. It's clear, it's formal, and that hides a lot of the process of learning and error making and error correction by doing that. So I'm just looking for hedge strategies so that this process will, A, not make the utilities already suspicious or hostile because of this, what the first background level will say, brings them into the process and just moves this along in a more experimental and learning environment, let's say, than it is a comprehensive assessment as the starting point.
So I think those are great comments, Paul. And I absolutely hear what you're saying. So in my view, a comprehensive assessment does two things. One, it takes the pure model it evaluates the input and the data that's collected from that model. But the final assessment has to be some sort of evaluation of what that means. And so that means looking at places that appear to be weak, looking at places that appear to be strong, and making some evaluation about whether or not those kind of measures have some sort of value within an organization. So I hear what you're saying about having a strict connection to a very narrow assessment, but I do think that this process creates a framework under which you can do kind of, I think, evaluations that are based on, quantitative facts. And I don't know if I throw it over to Duncan and see if you have any comments around that.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Paul. Good point. I would fully agree, and I think I intended it to be implicit in the point of assessing is an attribute present or not, that it should be a core competence, certainly of an independent assessor, to be able to provide detailed feedback. We've tried extremely hard to make the individual attributes as tight as possible, but there's always going to be scale with a scale of achievement within any attribute, and an independent assessor would be expected to represent that scale narratively to the utilities in a write-up of an assessment.
Dr. Cooper, did you want to add something really quickly, and then we're going to go to our break at 10:25?
Sure, thanks for the opportunity. I just wanted to say I've used quantification methods for 3 decades, and as yet I've never just given the company, the client, the organization, here's a set of graphs, here's a set of numbers, off you go. There's always been an analysis. There's always qualitative analysis that goes with and the quants. If you go in a qualitative report, you don't have any quantification. You have no idea where you are in terms of a benchmark. Was it someone in Australia last week described it to me as going on a fishing expedition? So it's great. You get all of these things, but if there's no numbers, there's no progress. You don't know where you are on some kind of maturity model where I had you assign people to the 5 different levels of effort. So you need the numbers, but they have to be interpreted. And I think that's really what I wanted to say, because I'm sorry, Dr. Schulman, you kind of created the impression that if it's quantification, you just hand over numbers and there is no analysis. So I just really wanted to address that. And I was really pleased to hear Duncan and Rich talk about, yeah, there's learning opportunities about the model. And we've already said, we know that there might be things that come up in the future, and we've deliberately built in re-examining the model, looking at things and to tweak it over time as we go forward to make sure that it's constantly on point. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you, Emma.
And let me make one more point. So I've heard your comment last week, Professor Schulman, regarding just starting with the comprehensive analysis. I don't think that this is a set it off and then we'll come back in 4 years and look at it again. I think there will likely be a whole set of processes that go on, starting with a comprehensive analysis. So I wouldn't place my bets on there only being nothing happening for 4 years.
No, I didn't mean to suggest that, and I also didn't mean that something is either qualitative or quantitative. I just was suggesting that a binary nominal variable does not, to me, represent a quantitative analysis at all. So that was only the question, the issue I was raising about that approach.
All right. thank you all for your discussion here. I'm going to go ahead and move us along to our 10-minute break. So I will see everyone back at 10:35 a.m. So we're pushing everything back just 5 minutes. Thank you.
Miss Emma, I'm back. Is my audio okay? I wasn't on earlier.
All right, we're at 10:35, so is Rich here?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started again. I'll pass it back over to you to start us with our safety culture indicators presentation.
Okay, thank you, Emma, and welcome back from our quick 10-minute break. So I wanted to talk a little bit about safety culture indicators. Let's go to the next slide, please, Emma. So as Duncan explained in the previous talk, the proposed pure model includes a suite of safety culture indicators, which are essentially live as the tier 3, part of the tier 3 model. These are the elements of the model that allows a utility or an independent assessor to measure um, um, current leading and lagging indicators of performance. And so this is where we're really getting into, the model really gets into more detailed elements of the utilities, practices, and culture. Next slide, please. So in each of the functional domain, there's a set of indicators. And again, this is going back to the previous slide. But each of these domains has a set of indicators associated with that. And so this allows for tracking for corrective actions, improvements, and initiatives in each of the domains. And again, the indicators really help a utility monitor its progress in each domain. So next slide here. So just as an example of some of these potential indicators. So this is an example of the safety leadership domain, and there's the focus area of responsibility, and at the tier 2 level, leadership responsibility. And so there are a number of indicators here, including for the lagging indicators, the number of management interactions with employees, number of safety inspections per month, number of legal or internal standards, non-conformances identified during safety inspections, number of times senior management attended safety meetings, percentage of employees working excessive hours, all sort of lagging indicators. Some of the other current indicators include the frequency of management interactions with workforce, percentage of hours worked that managers are present with workforce to provide guidance and support, percentage of production of products, services assessed for their health and safety impact. And then the leading indicator indicated on the slide is the number of times work activities have been stopped due to unsafe conditions or acts. So a number of challenges for a utility. Obviously, a number of these things may or may not be tracked currently. They may be tracked in various different ways or in different forms in different business units. So developing these numbers, tracking these numbers could be at the initial stage a bit of a challenge. But I believe that a lot of this information is available, although not necessarily tracked currently. I do want to talk a little bit about how to interpret these numbers and how to interpret these metrics. If you look at, for example, the leading indicator for T3, the number of times work activities have been stopped due to unsafe conditions or acts. So let's think about that for a minute. that number could be over a period of time, it could be increasing or it could be decreasing. If you have a new organization that's just beginning to think about its safety practices in a more robust way, they might start to find things, activities that were unsafe that weren't previously indicated as unsafe. So that number could be rising, which might indicate an improving safety culture, as that number goes up. But so if they start identifying issues that they hadn't identified before. But in a more mature culture, they might actually have fewer unsafe conditions. And so that number could begin to decrease. So whether that number is increasing or decreasing could depend on a number of different factors. And so I think the real point here and the real key is that the change in those numbers, the change in these indicators is really one of the things that's most important. And not necessarily what that absolute value is, but what is the change and what is the utility doing to understand what's behind that change and why it's changing. And so these indicators, I think, are really good, set up a very good monitoring system for utilities to say that these are things we can look at. These are things that can help us understand what activities, what's going on within our utility, and where can we improve on them. So again, my main point with a number of these is that they're not necessarily absolute values, but there are measures that can be used to identify changes, both positive and negative. And again, positive change and negative changes, these are not always increasing. They're not always decreasing. They could be sometimes increasing and sometimes decreasing. And this goes back to kind of what fundamental challenges of these safety culture science is that there's still a lot that's unknown and changing. And really also a lot that's dependent on an individual utility and not necessarily as a something that's easily transferable from one utility to another. For instance, one utility might have this number be increasing, and that could be an indication of making progress, and another utility might have this number be decreasing, and that could also be an indicator of making progress. So a lot of judgment has to be used in assessing these values. But the other thing is there's so many other of these indicators in many domains is that there's really a robust set of information that can be gathered about the utilities, practices, and the trends that are occurring within their organization. So next slide, please. So SPD is proposing working with IUs to maintain the integrity, veracity, and validity of the list of indicators to ensure that the relevance and applicability of these indicators over time. We recognize that there are a number of issues that may be important to the utilities that we don't yet recognize. There may be a number of issues that are important to the commission, which we don't yet recognize. And so we want to be cognizant of the fact that we don't know everything yet, and that we may want to measure things in different ways. We may want to measure things more discreetly or less discreetly. So we want to be cognizant of that. And there are currently other groups, North American Regulators is working group on safety culture indicators research project, which Emma found this reference for me. Thank you, Emma. And they're aimed to identify a suite of safety culture indicators that could be used to facilitate greater awareness. So we're happy to work with organizations like that and contribute to kind of any kind of information that we gather in this process over the next few years. I also want to talk about things such as safety performance metrics and the energy safety and annual safety culture assessment. One of the things that Dr. Cooper did was to use the safety performance metrics to help calibrate this particular model. Um, so that's the performance metrics are a set of metrics that were developed a few years ago. We believe that there are other important safety performance metrics that could be developed, and that they would also help us understand safety culture in different ways, and also help us understand what safety performance metrics make sense. Finding this alignment between the safety culture of an organization and metrics which help us understand the performance of safety, I think are two things that kind of go hand in hand. We want to understand that we're tracking the right things, and we want to understand that utilities are also making progress in developing their safety culture. So I think a little bit of a symbiotic relationship between identifying safety performance metrics and also identifying how safety culture is driven by the identification of things that are important, uh, um, as expressed in the safety performance metrics, is also a really great opportunity for us to really build and develop metrics and indicators that are most meaningful to the utilities and the commission. So that's sort of the brief overview of where we are on indicators within the pure model. I think there's still a lot more work to do. I certainly welcome a lot more input from IRUs and interveners on what they believe would be important indicators and performance metrics that should be looked at. So I'd like to open it up for questions and see what folks' thoughts, questions, or comments are.
Dr. Schulman, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, I promise I will have a ration on how many times I actually offer a comment. I'm getting close to the end of the ration. But anyway, I wanted to go back to the.
No problem. I was expecting yours.
That's even worse for me. Anyway, I wanted to go back to the leading and lagging indicators in the safety domain. Generally speaking, a lagging indicator is an accident or something negative that you're trying not to have, or if there are no accidents, those are good too over a period of years. But they're things that are most closely related to the actual events or the goal that you're trying to directly achieve. The leading indicators are things that are not in themselves a negative thing, but might be a hint of something to come. So, in some respects, the study of safety culture and indicators of safety culture are perforce kind of leading indicators, because none of them are directly performance issues or directly outcome issues. They are things that hopefully give you some predictive framework to talk about whether those bad things will happen. So I would say that most of the safety culture metrics and indicators that you're going to be working on, you hope will be leading indicators. You don't have to wait until there's an accident. That's because, it's important to distinguish organizations that simply have great records because they're what we call failing to fail. They're lucky, as opposed to things that have a dynamic process that keeps them from failing. So when you said this one about number of times activities have been stopped, that is, to me, almost a lagging indicator. That's a failure indicator right there. If you have to stop activities and have a safety stand down, that already is, it's a lagging thing because it's happened and it's already a negative thing. And so it seems to me that, I don't know that it's that important, but I would consider leading, and most people, when they're looking for leading indicators, are looking for things and conditions that actually forestall something that would be measured by a lagging indicator. That's why most safety lagging indicators are just accidents that happen or injuries on the job or whatever those things are. Those are all lagging. So I don't know that it's, I think you might want to think about what constitutes lagging and leading, because calling the things that you're calling lagging for most people would be goals, would be leading indicators, and they'd really like to have those as leading indicators.
I think I'll throw it to Dr. Cooper to respond for that one.
Hi, Dr. Shulman. We're back again. How are you? I think you make some valid points, and I'm not going to argue against it per se. I think it's a matter of interpretation. So we know if you stop the job, then you've stopped an adverse incident. If you've stopped a sequence of events that could lead to an adverse event, and by stopping, you haven't had an adverse event, in that sense, they could be seen as leading. Yes? So it's about your lens. It's about the lens that you're looking. We deliberately didn't call these key leading indicators, because key leading indicators is kind of what you're talking about, which is where a key leading indicator, something like a safety culture assessment, is linked to strategy of the organization. Yes? So we deliberately left out the words key, KPIs, and all the rest of it, because they're just indicators that can help you look at the leadership responsibility. So if you take the Deepwater Horizon, the guys on the platform asked the questions of the senior leaders who were on the platform of whether this thing should be stopped, what is it, what does it mean, and so on. And the leadership said, oh, we're going to give an award, you get on with it. And off they went. Now, if the leadership had said, well, time out, there's incomprehension here, people are not clear what they're doing, let's just stop the job, stop this, and keep this under control until everybody knows what it's doing, we might not have had the Deepwater Horizon, albeit that was one of the final defenses. Okay, so it really is a matter of interpretation. What we tried to do with these was say, here's these functional domains, 1 and 2, the 2 levels. Here's some indicators that's like, I think you might remember Woolworths used to have a pick and mix counter of candy. You could go in a Woolworths and I'll take a couple of these and a couple of that, and I put them in a bag and they weigh them, and then off you go with this bag of candy. And this is, think of these indicators in the same light. And as Rich started to said at the very beginning, these are offered. That we're not saying that IOUs have to do any of these. These are offered as indicators. If they want to use them, great. If they've got alternatives, great. Let us know what they are. The source of these came from after the Deepwater Horizon. I wrote a book called Strategic Safety Culture Roadmap. And while we were doing that book, there was a lot of work going on. And how did we get to the Deepwater Horizon? What was behind it? What were the indicators? Would it have stopped it? Would it have not stopped it? And there's all these different things that came up. So we developed a whole suite of these indicators. At the same time, or perhaps in a similar time frame, the National Safety Council also came up with a suite of indicators. So what we've done here is these indicators are taken out the Strategic Safety Culture Roadmap, and we've merged them with the National Safety Council's suite of indicators and put them together. And what was interesting this morning, I went to look at this working group's statistics, indicators, sorry. And when I went through them, 90% of them are in exactly the same functional domains as we had. They've put them down as leadership and resilience, employee engagement, and vigilance. And when you look at those, and again, I was looking at their indicators and I'm looking at these and I'm thinking, they're pretty similar. We're in the same ballpark. And maybe we take this research, we take these 100 and, no, there's 90, I think there's 90 items here. We can take these 90 items, we can compare them to these indicators and say, have we covered that, yay or nay? There's some in the working group's documentation that's specific to nuclear. So it has an accountability officer. They actually employ someone to take the can if something goes wrong, which I find stunning. But there you go. I wouldn't think that's a good thing to do. I think that everyone should be accountable. You don't employ someone to take the can. But that's the things that they've come up with. There's 6 or 7 of those. Okay, well, that's a bit odd, but that's my interpretation. Okay, so you know, as Rich said, we're going forward. As we go forward, we will tweak. If these are not suitable, if the IOU say none of these are suitable, we don't want to use any of them, they're not helping us, then we get rid of them, and we'll find some that do work. Maybe the IOU does not.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. What I meant to say was it's not so much the issue of what you call a lagging indicator or leading indicator, in the sense that a lot of people criticize metrics because they are lagging indicators and they're not looking ahead to things that could cause an accident. That's what they call leading indicators. So if they were to look at this and you're saying this is your only leading indicator, and all what you call lagging indicators, they would say those are leading indicators. Those are good. You would actually not get the praise you deserve from those people, because they would see what you're calling lagging indicators as leading indicators, as indeed they would call much of what the safety culture indicators are leading indicators. That's all I was trying to say.
I also want to make an observation here, which is kind of interesting, going to this pure model, with the several 10 domains. So this is a domain of safety leadership. And I think of, a frontline manager looking at this number of times the activities have been stopped. And they might think of this as, my guys are identifying problems and accidents aren't happening, right? And so they might look at that as a very positive sign. Now, if you look at the strategic functional domain, the strategic view might be, gee, there are lots of work stoppages going on. That's not good. We have something going on that we haven't addressed. And so from those two different perspectives, the strategic management view, this is maybe a bad thing. From the frontline manager, it's a good thing. So it's a complex situation about looking at these kind of indicators, but in both scenarios, they're useful. You just need to know really which scenario you're looking at. And that's kind of goes back to the previous point of the numbers alone aren't good enough. There really needs to be an assessment that goes along, an evaluation that goes along with the numbers, which I think also goes back to the usefulness of having both a comprehensive third-party assessor and the IOU self-assessment process. We kind of get two different views of almost the same thing, looking at things from a slightly different angle. So I think that's a very important feature of what we've proposed.
Thanks, Rich. Tom, you have your hand raised, and you also put some suggestions in the chat. Do you want to just read off your suggestions, or would you like me to?
I'm just hoping Dr. Cooper can address my comment.
Why don't you go ahead and restate your comment, just in case there's people that are audio only.
Okay. So I've read your material, and I'm thinking about this in intensity of each utility setting out, what's normative for themselves on what they're trying to achieve based on an intimate understanding of day-to-day operations within the utility. And if the SMS is so critical, which we think it is, then the goals, the SMS goals alone, this progress goals, making progress, conducted successfully, the product should be an excellent safety culture. Is that not another way to come at this measuring where we're kind of debating the efficacy of each individual item? And then it's sort of an add-on is I wonder how INPO is measuring. I got to do some research to see that, but interested to hear your response.
Okay, well, it's an interesting one. Back in 2007 or 8, when I was working in the oil and gas in the Middle East, we actually put together, we have a model of safety culture that I produced based on Albert Bandura's work in 2000. And it basically looks at the reciprocal interaction between the safety management system, what people do on the ground during their day-to-day activity, and how perhaps they think and feel about safety. So hearts and minds piece, if you like. From research that we've done, the hearts and minds piece will always follow the situation, i.e. the safety management system and whatever you do there, and behavior. Those two, in terms of actual safety performance, seem to be the two most critical features of this safety culture. So back in 2007, 2008, we got the chance to test this. So we had 3 independent third parties doing the work for an oil and gas major. So we had a safety management system audit by one party. We had a safety perception survey done by another party, and I was there doing the behavioural approach. So we were working on the leadership's behaviour and the employees' behaviour, putting in a great big behavioural-based safety system. So we had 3 different things that were measuring the 3 parts of the model. We were able to align the categories of what was being looked at by the survey and the audit and the behaviour. So whether it was, and it followed James Reason's model, incident causation model. So we were looking at senior leadership, and we were looking at middle management, and then we were looking at the non-operational support functions, HR, procurement, finance, and so on. Then the guys' behaviour on the job, whether they were contractors or the clients, it didn't really matter. And then the defences, all the different, the risk assessments, the documentation, and so on and so forth. And we were able to merge all of those things together. And it was, in a sense, it was a triangulation exercise, because we were able to find out where a safety management system was picking up something or indicating it was very strong. The actual behaviour and the perception didn't match. They were much lower. So putting the 3 things together is actually very, very, very helpful. And it's one of the things that we've tried to build in this model. If you think of the slide earlier on, where we're talking about, we've got safety perception data coming in from the OIES and somewhere else from some other source into, from the IOUs into some other aspect of the CPUC, there is safety management system audit data coming in. And we're suggesting that we use those 2 data streams to help triangulate, again, on a bigger scale, if you like, the actual maturity ratings and the assessment in that way. So that way we're getting a bigger holistic picture of what's going on. So I'm not sure if there's an actual ratio. I mean, the ratios that we're finding is there's roughly 80% of the safety culture cake is the situation, the safety management system, if you like. But it's also more than that, because the situation's set by the board and the decision making and so on and so forth that they make. So it's beyond just the safety management system. There's an argument, and I think you've touched on it, which says, can you use the safety management system to identify your safety culture? So Granetta wrote, I think in 2000, had said that there's cultural clues that come through your audit data. And I think Mark Fleming has also indicated the same, and I can't remember what year that he was talking about it, of doing so. And I think he's on a journey of even trying to do so. In our experience, and it's quite extensive in 60 odd countries, do it to a certain extent, but it'll only take you so far. It doesn't get, as Dr. Schulman said earlier on, there are aspects that you could miss and will miss just from focusing on the safety management system. So this is where the true value of triangulation comes in, that you've got these different data streams. I understand the IOUs, for example, are doing behavioural safety or behaviour-based safety processes. They've got all these data streams coming in about what people do on the job. They've also got their near-miss reports, and they've got safety suggestions and a whole host of other data. And again, they're all data streams that could, in theory, come into the mix. It's a way of, it's about how we do that, and it's about how do we do it so that it's consistent across all the IOUs. I think that's something that perhaps we're losing sight of. Each IOU is going to have a different safety culture or different ways of doing things. And if we have a consistent framework that we can use to capture all of this information and so that it's understandable by everybody and gives us a benchmark, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, then we've got a framework and a benchmark as we go forward. So I hope that helps. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Emma, if you're speaking, you're muted, my friend.
Thank you. I'm surprised that I've only done that a few times. I was just going to call out a couple of comments in the chat before we move on to our next presentation, since we're a little bit behind schedule. So Sonja said that in developing metrics, many utilities utilize contract staff. So policies like stop work help cover contractors and protect both utility assets and the lives of the crew. And then Mina said, I think the number of times work activities have stopped due to unsafe conditions or acts is always a reflection of good safety culture. It may be a reflection of unsafe conditions, but having someone on site who can assess the risk and dares to stop the job reflects good safety culture. And so thank you for those comments. We can dig into those more in our discussion session later on. But for now, we're going to move on to a presentation from the Western Area Power Administration. And this presentation is going to sort of pivot from the theoretical conversation on safety culture assessments that we've been having to a more practical discussion of how one organization operationalizes safety into everything they do. So I'm going to pass it over to Ricardo and Chris to talk a little bit about their efforts. I'm going to stop sharing this screen and switch over to a new screen. Just making sure I should advance the slides, right? Okay, great.
I'll do what you need me to do, so you let me know what's best for you, Miss Emma.
I can advance them. Okay.
Okay.
Just one moment. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
We got it.
Great. Okay.
Okay, so just to make sure I meet your time expectations, we're looking at probably 50 minutes.
Yeah, so I think we're gonna go to lunch around noon. So we have until then for the presentation plus question and answer.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Well, Emma, thank you for coordinating all this. Thank you, CPUC, for inviting us to speak. I love the utility industry. I love how we interact with these different agencies and stuff. So I'm really grateful to be here today speaking with you all, especially on the practical application on how a safety culture translates into like a safe system, how we reliably operate a transmission system. So I'll talk a bit about a couple different aspects of Wapa. But I'm partnered here with my friend Ricardo Velarde. We both work for Sonia Anderson, who you've heard from over in the chat, and then Corey Danton is also here from Wapa. So feel free to ask questions as we go along, and help keep us on track, and just make sure that we're adding value to the conversation by asking those questions. So next slide, please, Miss Emma. So just a little bit about myself. My name is Chris Lyles. I am a project and program lead and a department lead for project and asset services here at Wapa. I'm in Lakewood, Colorado, just outside Denver. So I'm happy to be with you over here on the West Coast virtually. But I lead a group that includes some asset management, geospatial information systems, asset maintenance, and then also project management for Wapa. And then Ricardo will be speaking to you a bit later. But really, the four main topics we'll cover today, an overview of Wapa, because I really think it's important for us to understand, who Wapa is as a utility, especially as we talk about some of our reliable and safe operations of our system. It'll help you have the bigger perspective as far as what we do for work. Then we'll get into asset management, how that contributes to a safe and reliable system. A quick touch point with GIS, and then we'll land on the wildfire mitigation and vegetation management with our boots on the ground and how that actually plays out in the field. So, next slide, please. Okay, so just some history on Wapa and kind of where we come from, the perspective that we offer. So we are a power marketing administration under the Department of Energy. So all or most of the people that you deal with at Wapa, we're all federal employees. So we're all DOE employees. We're a power marketing administration. We're one of 4 PMAs. We cover 15 states. You can see that we have other business partners that do a lot of the same things that we do. So BPA, Bonneville Power up in the Northwest, Southwest Power Administration, and then Southeast Power Administration. But see Wapa's territory there in the blue. So next, Miss Emma. So as you can see, primarily the people from Wapa that you work with are from our SNR or Sierra Nevada region out in California, but there are 4 total regions here at Wapa. We have Upper Great Plains, just south of Canada. We have Rocky Mountain region over in Colorado, the Desert Southwest region over in Phoenix, and we have a CRIS Management Center, which does a lot of the power marketing functions there in the green. But our main mission in life is essentially to take electrons, hydroelectric electrons out of 57 hydro dams in the West. You can see them all marked by yellow here on the screen. Take those electrons out of the dams, find off-takers or market that power to our customers, and our customers typically are co-ops, municipalities, other power delivery agencies that are essentially not-for-profit that are taking federal hydropower generated at these dams and getting it to underserved communities, essentially. So we partner a lot with the dams. We don't operate the dams. We don't own the dams. Those are typically, Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation. But our part comes in with the power marketing, so finding off-takers for the power. And then once we do the power marketing part, we do the transmission service for them. So we have 17,000 miles of transmission line that we transport electrons on to our end-use customers. And as you can imagine, hydrologic conditions, the water behind the dam really drives a lot of our business. And that's obviously changing a lot, right? Because hydro dams are, kind of under the stronghold of this drought we have in the West. So next slide, please. So, we'll get into this a little bit more here in the next few slides, but I'm just wanting to be intentional about making the jump from the theory of safety culture to like the practical application of it. So we're taking a little bit different position on this presentation today. So, we do have obviously a strong safety culture at Wapa. A lot of the work that we do is inherently dangerous because we are operating a transmission system. So we are in substations, maintaining power circuit breakers, maintaining transformers, maintaining these transmission lines that you see in front of you. So that obviously requires a really strong safety culture to make sure we keep our folks safe. And a lot of the work that we do on the system, we do it while the system's energized. So we do work on 230 kV transmission lines, 500 kV, 500,000 volt transmission lines with the line still energized. So to do this safely, you have to have a strong safety culture. So it really is kind of weaved throughout a lot of what we do at Wapa. It is part of our senior leader discussions as far as how we implement safety. How do we make sure that we are have our hands around a strong safety culture here? And recently we've shifted to I think some of the folks have already mentioned it this morning. We've recently shifted to a human performance just culture program and kind of that perspective on safety. So we are, essentially, living or following these five principles of human performance as culture. And I'll read them because they're relatively new to us, but it's something that we're working into our existing and traditional safety culture. So really the five principles for us behind human performance just culture are, people are not perfect, and even the best can make mistakes. Two, situations that lead to unplanned events are foreseeable, manageable, and can be prevented. Number three, organizational factors greatly influence individual behaviors. So in a large majority of all unplanned events can be directly attributed to organizational factors. Number four, the use of positive reinforcement for appropriate behavior helps individuals achieve higher levels of performance. And five, a complete understanding of why past unplanned events happen can help prevent future incidents. And I know as we've incorporated this human performance just culture, you can really see the shift in how we evaluate incidents and how we respond to issues that come up. And it's really encouraging people to approach their work lives differently, approach issues or mistakes, however you want to see it, differently, and how we bring those forward. So I'm really seeing that play out in reality here at Wapa. But let me jump back into the safety kind of reliable operation of our power system, because the way we see it, if you operate a reliable system, if it's reliable, then it's an indicator that it's also a safe system. And how do we understand how safe the system is? So just to give you some visual on what Wapa does, we've got these transmission lines in front of us on the screen right now. So we have 177,000 of these structures, 17,000 miles of this line that interconnects a bunch of substations. We have 350 substations. And the whole point of the system is to pull electrons out of hydro dams in the West, the 15 states that Wapa operates in, and deliver that to customers. So next, Ms. Emma. This is just a visual of a typical Wapa substation. You can see it's on the bank of a river. There's a river in the background, and on the far upper left, there's a hydroelectric dam. So this is Glen Canyon Dam out of Page, Arizona. But really, the whole purpose of a substation is to transform power either up or down in voltages. We ship those electrons over our transmission lines, but really, what I'm going to talk about today, the meat of the discussion is how do we operate these facilities safely? How do we ensure their reliability? And a reliable system is a safe system. So next, Emma. So it's important to mention our core values because it ties right into our culture of safety. And these values that Wapa has, we don't just have them posted, we actually live by them. As a Wapa employee, you'll likely hear at least one of these core values throughout your day. They're brought up in meetings. They really drive a lot of the decisions that we make. So I thought it was worth mentioning, these core values and why we hold them so dear to our hearts. One, listen to understand and speak with purpose. Two, seek, share, and partner, and that's kind of what we're doing here. Is we're partnering with you guys on the safety culture aspect. We're seeking additional knowledge, and we're wanting to share what we know about our system with you all. Respect self, others, and the environment. Do what is right and do what is safe. So that's a key attribute of how we live our lives here. Be curious, learn more, do better, and repeat. And then at the end of the day, we're public servants and we want to serve like our lights depend on it. Not just our lights, but your lights as well. So next. So we got just a few slides on asset management and GIS, and then we'll get into wildfire mitigation and what it looks like is boots on the ground. So asset management, like a formal asset management program, is a relatively new approach for a lot of utilities. It kind of came on strong maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But really what it means to Wapa is that we are assessing our assets. When I say assets, I'm talking about power circuit breakers, transformers, transmission lines, anything that makes up a significant part of the bulk electric system, and really assessing those assets, and are they performing like they're expected to, and if they're not, what are we going to do about it? So really, the first bullet here is, we are collecting inspection results from our field crews. So we have field crews that are out on the transmission system daily. We have electricians in substations. We have transmission line folks, linemen on the transmission lines. They're doing inspections routinely on these lines. All the transmission lines are inspected at least once a year. Substations are inspected once a month. And this data that's being collected, it's being collected on tablets, just like an iPad or whatever. The inspection results are documented and then moved into a database. And these databases have algorithms built into them, and they come up with health indices or an HI health index, and we also drive decisions around risk-based decisions. So we couple our health with the consequence of that asset failure, and we come up with a risk-based decision as far as how to manage and safely and reliably run our system. But really, the whole point of an asset management program is to, one, understand the health of your system, and with the assumption that if you have a healthy system, it's also a reliable and safe system as well. But really, the key tenet of a good asset management program is really understanding the health of assets, but also understanding if an asset fails, what that does to the system, what that does to reliability and safety of the system. And we define that as consequence. So if you understand the consequence of an asset failure, marry that information to the health of those assets, then you can come up with a risk score. So once you know risk, then you can start making determinations as far as what you want to do about assets that fall outside of a specific risk threshold. So what we do here at Wapa is we assess the health, we assess the consequence, come up with a risk. Any assets that fall outside of a specific risk tolerance are flagged, and we can do a couple different things to bring those back into compliance. Replacement is definitely not the first approach. We look at, okay, can we maintain this asset back into performance? Can we do some work on the transmission line? Can we do some oil processing on the transformers and bring those back into performance standards that are acceptable? Number two, do we understand the risk, and then do we accept it? So in some cases, if the consequence is low and the risk is low, then we accept the risk and could potentially run that asset to failure, depending on where it lies in the system. And then third is always a replacement action. We can always replace a transformer, a breaker, or a T-line. But that's not always our go-to, just because it's expensive, takes time, and is not the most prudent way forward. Next, Ms. Emma. So I just wanted to show an example of what data might look like out of our asset management program. So it might be really small for you on your screen, so hard to read. So I'll explain kind of what you're seeing in front of you. So in the upper left is a transmission system from our DSW region, Desert Southwest region over in Phoenix. It touches parts of California, but these are our transmission lines in that part of the country. It's showing inspection results from, I think, maybe 2 years ago. And in the upper right, we're identifying the very specific attributes that we're inspecting on a transmission line. So I mentioned earlier, we have 177,000 structures total that are within our span of control. In the upper right, there are 16 individual lines, one starting with anchor being the first one, and then going all the way down to vibration dampener on the right. So there's 16 different attributes. These 16 attributes are inspected for on each of those 177,000 structures. And how they're being inspected for is, we're either inspecting by helicopter, doing ground patrols. The the inspectors in the field are using the tiered approach in the bottom left-hand corner and assigning it an A through an E value. A being, in my opinion, like awesome in nature, you know, green, or all the way down to E, which is the red coloring, which indicates that there's a significant problem. So we are assigning these values, A through E, to the 16 different factors over 177,000 structures, displaying it, getting this into the hands of our maintenance professionals within the regions, and that's how we decide, you know, where to do maintenance, where to do capital replacements, based on our inspection criteria that you see in front of you. Next, Ms. Emma. So I'm going to shift from asset management and inspection of assets and the health of assets to GIS. GIS kind of does two things for us. And I call it geographical information systems here, but it's also geospatial. You'll see it a couple different ways. But really, how we use GIS, it's a system of record for all of our transmission line inspections. So as our line folks are inspecting transmission lines and identifying, you know, either vegetation issues like, you know, trees or whatever growing up into the lines or close to the lines, vegetation issues are identified during the inspection and get into our GIS system. And GIS is a system of record for all of our T-line activity, including all the physical inspections that I just mentioned on the previous slide. GIS is great because it's a great way to see, you know, the entire footprint of Wapa and how transmission lines are laid out, where they are intersecting with communities, you know, and it's a great representation as far as what inspections are being done, a quick visual on where you might have veg issues and what condition that your system is in. And, you know, tying back into you know, the direction we're getting ready to go in the next part of the presentation is you know, wildfire mitigation. A significant part of our GIS system is you know, wildfire situational awareness. You know, so we have a couple layers built into our GIS system that, you know, shows you know, active weather around our system, lightning strikes, the wildfire potential. So it's showing, you know, it's pulling in information from the Forest Service, what type of moisture content is currently in the leaves of the vegetation around our transmission lines. So it gives us good situational awareness on you know, how we can best operate this transmission system among the conditions that our lines are in, you know, specifically to wildfire. So the next slide will show an example of what an system operator might see on our GIS system. So this is showing, you know, northern part of California, the Central Valley. It's hard to pick out Wapa lines in there, but there's Wapa lines in red, and this is showing the current wildfire potential. This was from last week, so it's really easy for our system operators to see, you know, where our lines are at, wildfire potential, the amount of moisture that may be you know, in the vegetation around our lines. We can make really wise, sound, safe, and, you know, reliable decisions based on current data that we're getting in from a number of different sources. But that's all I've got for GIS and asset management, like the physical inspection of the system, like the physical condition of our system, and ensuring that it is operating safely. I'm going to transition now over to Ricardo, and Ricardo's going to talk more about what it looks like from the boots on the ground perspective, and how we mitigate for wildfire. So Ricardo, it's all you, my friend.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, Chris. So I'm Ricardo Velarde. I'm the Vegetation and Access Road Specialist for Wapa in the Sierra Nevada region. And I do appreciate the opportunity to be here today and provide an overview of what we do with our vegetation and wildfire mitigation programs. And from our perspective, on our side of the program, how we strive to foster a healthy safety culture. You know, So just for our program overview, the main purpose of these programs is to ensure that our transmission lines are safe from vegetation encroachments that could cause an outage or ignite a fire. This involves typically reclaiming our right-of-ways by removing all incompatible plant species within the right-of-way. And an incompatible plant species is going to be any kind of plant species that at full maturity can interfere with our transmission line or create unacceptable fuel loading within our right-of-way. In those areas where we don't have the authority to remove vegetation to something compatible, we have developed encroachment thresholds, such as in orchards or parks with important heritage oaks, or personal property with landscaping trees that they don't want to do away with. So we develop these thresholds that we have to keep mindful of, and these are dictate the clearance that we have to maintain between the structure or the conductor and the vegetation at all times. In addition to those, we also have to mitigate for off right-of-way hazard trees. These are trees that are dead, dying, or structurally compromised outside of our maintained right-of-way that we don't have rights to, but that we can go outside after discussing with the landowner and remove any potential trees that can fall into our lines. So how do we start mitigating these risks? So we start by getting as much information as we can on our current situation. We use aerial photography, videos, we use LiDAR, a lot of the remote sensing data that Chris just showed you through our GIS systems that we have access to. Let's see. And regular ground patrols and aerial patrols to inspect conditions firsthand. And these are only some of the tools that we use that we use to kind of assess our current condition and the risk. And once we identify the risks and hazards, we develop an approach to mitigate them. First thing we try and do is eliminate the issue altogether from the process. We may go out and try and buy out the orchards, or we'll pay landowners to remove landscape trees and replace them with compatible ones. Or we, in certain cases, will try and expand our right-of-way and capture more of what's currently off right-of-way hazard trees and convert that into a maintained right-of-way where we reclaimed it and can minimize the potential for trees coming into our lines from the off right-of-way. And for every else, we set up a process that ensures that we are always aware of what the current conditions is. If we can't remove the threat, then we have to be aware of what it is on a continual basis through regular patrols, through the timing of the patrols. And then we also use integrated vegetation management, which simply means that we consider many different methods and factors in determining how to best approach removing that vegetation and maintaining that vegetation to its desired condition. Next slide, please. So our wildfire mitigation plan supplements our vegetation management program. Basically lays out what we already do to prevent vegetation-related encroachments and incorporates efforts to mitigate wildfires in our service area. The objectives being to minimize the probability that the design, operation, and maintenance of Wapa's facilities may be the origin or a contributing source to the ignition of a wildfire or contribute to the spread of a wildfire. We establish communication protocols in this document among all our internal departments and transmission grid operators regarding any potential de-energizations of lines during a wildfire threat. We progressively apply the most effective wildfire prevention and mitigation strategies, and we strive to annually improve the plan by monitoring and adjusting our approach. Over the last few years, we've changed some of the approaches how we've managed our right-of-ways and inspected our lines. We changed the timing to be adjusted to be completed before fire seasons. We incorporated additional inspections to our area and ground ground patrols to include infrared and corona scans that can identify issues before potentially someone visually can detect them. We've done extensive removals of vegetation accumulated fuels in higher threat areas, and those are prioritized over others. And we've also been working with other agencies like the Forest Service and coordinating with them and their timber thinning projects so that we have stretches broader than our right-of-ways that are safer buffers in case of wildfires. Next slide, please. So, for each task that we look at, we look for applicable job hazard analysis for the type of work that we're doing on that project. Someone has done this before, we've done this before, so if there are known risks and we can eliminate it, we'll try and do that. If it's been documented what the risks are, we can take that to our current condition, our current site, and work with those known risks and try and mitigate them. For sites, for site conditions, we usually look at terrain, what the weather outlooks. Do we have to worry about heat and cold stress? Are there dangerous plants out there, wasps or bees? We look at our equipment. Do we have the appropriate PPE on site? What kind of voltage are we dealing with, and what are the minimum approach distances? Is equipment grounded? In terms of certain areas where we have to work near homeless encampments, we make sure folks are aware of those dangers as well in terms of biological, chemical, and physical hazards on the ground. We look at who we have working on the site. Are they trained? Have they worked near high voltage lines? Can they communicate effectively any concerns or issues? And do they feel comfortable reporting those issues? That we always encourage. With the scarcity of trained and skilled workers nowadays, you really do have to be very aware of who you have on the site. Where did they come from? What kind of background do they have? It may be different than what was initially reported by a contractor, and we have to be mindful of what that situation is out there. So all these different factors provide us a situational awareness for that site, which can prevent personal injury or damage. Next slide, please. So, for Wapa, the first layer of our overall safety culture and the recognition that the first layer of protection for all of us is our overall safety culture and the recognition that safety is an inherent part of our work. It's not something disassociated with it. It is part of our work. We never discuss any project without making sure we're doing it safely, and that is part of the task itself. As Chris said, the nature of our work, working as a utility with high voltage transmission lines running through steep, difficult terrain and high fire threat areas, makes it essential that everyone from upper management down to our grounds people understand that safety is their responsibility, and everyone in that spectrum between the top and bottom is free to speak up and even stop work if necessary. And any lessons learned, we encourage its distribution throughout the group there. If anyone sees anything during any kind of meeting out there, we encourage that it's shared. Additionally, we use, like I said before, all available equipment and tools that we have to provide a safe environment. We switched over from ATVs to UTVs because they offer more protections. For some jobs, we have battery-operated chainsaws that folks use to reduce the fire hazards. In situations where we can't change the equipment, we'll use our operating procedures to make the work site safe. Like I said before, we'll use the appropriate PPE and equipment. We'll use the GIS resources to know where we are and what the fire threat is. We'll have weather monitoring services to kind of give us an idea of what weather we're going to be working on. And in field, we also have highly experienced arborists and foresters who are trained recognizing the skill level of our contractors who are on site or anyone else who is on site. And they can determine quickly if it's safe for that person to continue working or not. And they themselves can stop work if they don't think it's a safe situation. And again, all these things are communicated throughout the job site with management, so they are aware how the task is going, and they can chime in if they see any concern. Next slide, please. So again, we encourage everyone to report any near misses that are encountered, so we can learn from them, analyze them, along with any incidents they're investigating, and they're analyzed, and we develop lessons learned from those events. And then we just document them, and we distribute them across Wapa on a regular basis through brochures, through other events or meetings. You know, if it's relevant to the work on hand, we'll ensure that those lessons get incorporated in a job hazard analysis, or very at least discussed at a tailgate meeting. You know, even if it's just a reminder, you know, or if it's already an established procedure, we'll bring it up and make sure everyone is refreshed on it and understands what the process is. And again, we encourage everyone on site that safety is a responsibility, and to look out for each other, and to feel free to speak up and report any issues that are encountered, and share with the group. I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris and Ricardo. We can move on to any questions that people have. So if you have questions, then you can raise your hand or type questions in the chat. Dr. Cooper, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot. You backfilled some of the information. I work with some of the vegetation management folks up here in Indiana, and it's kind of nice to see the background stuff going on there. But my question was more, I mean, I heard what you say, and I applaud 100% really everything that you told us. But my question is, how do you assess? How do you know what you know? I think that's really the question. How do you know that you've got a great safety culture? How do the guys? And I can hear what you say, and I can see the things. And I'm a tradesman as well. I'm a scaffolder by trade. I was in the Corps of Engineers, so I know kind of what it looks like on the front end, but it's the back end that I'm kind of interested. I've been out there with the vegetation management guys. I've been out there with the guys up on the poles and all this bit, and they really have been brilliant. But there's still opportunity, you know. So that's really my question to you and to Chris. How is it you get a handle on your culture? How do you know?
So from a personal experience, you know, for us, you know, with the tree cutting crews, they are normally contractors that we don't have a lot of control of. So that's why it's really important for the Wapa field inspectors to be on site and be able to determine who is on site, what's their mentality on safety. But from the Wapa side, I've been working for Wapa since 2009, and one of the first things that you know, happened to me, and this is, you know, I was starting as a natural resource specialist. We were taking a UTV out in the field, and it was my first time driving a UTV with someone else going to be driving it. We loaded it up to the trailer, and at the time it was pretty new. No one really knew me, and I was just looking at the UTV on the trailer and not really sure how to unstrap it yet. I wasn't going to do it until I had the person who was with me do it. But two folks, a lineman and someone, another person from the crafts came up, didn't even know me. They asked me what I was concerned about, and they kind of told me what things as experienced UTV drivers I would have to look for, and what I had to make sure was strapped on well, and when I took it off the trailer, what I needed to look for. That was without even asking. They just knew that they saw someone that was uncomfortable with the situation, and they walked up to me, spoke up, and made sure that I knew what I knew, so that I'd be safe. And that has been a recurring theme in my career with WAPA. It's inherent, and I say that as honestly as I can. It's inherent to everything we do. You're out there, and first thing that comes out of people's mouths is, how can we do this safely or safer? I know, how do we assess? What kind of metrics can we use? I don't know the answer to that. I just know that what really kind of stood out to me when someone was saying culture and said it was like an inherent to the work, that's the first thing I thought of, because throughout my career, people are always kind of interjecting themselves outside of their like silo, if you will, to kind of make sure that the person that isn't maybe completely familiar with a piece of equipment or something that's new to them understands that there's a danger there, and this is what they can do to mitigate it. Again, I think someone had mentioned earlier, management always brings up safety, always supports you when there's a safety issue. We have a problem with the contract because of safety issues. Management will go directly to our procurement offices and make sure that we are addressing it. Again, it's if there's an issue, it's addressed rather quickly, and it's not hidden, and it's out in the open. And that's just from my personal perspective. And Chris, Corey?
I'll add that I'll open the door for Miss Anderson as well, because she's on the senior leader team and might have a different perspective too. But our shift toward the human performance just culture and methodology, for lack of a better word, I think has been significant. Because not only from like Ricardo's perspective out in the field, but also how we are operating our system, like our system operators that are pushing and pulling the buttons behind a computer screen that impact how the system operates and runs. Those folks really have to operate within that same culture as well. And when there's an issue under that human performance just culture methodology or theory, I've seen a distinct shift in how we approach the resolution and lessons learned, because there definitely is no finger pointing. People are really interested in understanding the root cause of what went on, what was the headspace of the person that was involved. And how can we alleviate that in the future? And it's more of a shift towards how do we do this better and not repeat the same mistakes, rather than okay, let's punish the person that did it and then move on. So I definitely see it as a significant and definitive shift in our approach. I'm sure our human performance and and safety department leaders have metrics that they use. I'm just unfamiliar with them. All I can do is based off of kind of what I see and what I've experienced from my own perspective. But Ms. Anderson, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So I would tell you that there's two things. One, I don't think we have a formal program, although I think if we were to document it, it would look very formal. We indoctrinate every single Wapa employee. So it's not just the field crews, the maintenance crews. Every single employee that starts at Wapa goes through an entire safety briefing, safety orientation. We make sure every employee goes out to the field, meets with the craft, learns what the craft does. And what that does is it gives the craft the opportunity to show what they do and talk about how safety is. And it teaches the accountant, the IT person, how critical our program is, how dangerous it is for the people that work there, so that it's always conscious in everybody's mind. Every person goes to the quarterly safety meetings. Every quarterly safety meeting, we go through the reports of what happened. And it's not just what happened at Wapa. We go through whatever safety incident that happens. So if it's in an IOU and they had a major safety incident, we review it, We check our processes. We check to make sure that those things are taken care of, and change any processes that we might have for those types of things. So while we don't have it documented as a how do we assess it, I suspect if we did, we'd probably come out with an interesting program.
Be good. Thank you.
Thank you. Did anyone have any other questions? Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, not so much a question. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing the information you gave. The inspections that you gave, I can see that you're being proactive in doing inspections on the lines and even showing to us that you do have some places that are high risk or level E, as you showed on your chart. And I really appreciate you being open and sharing that with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to pause again to see if there's any hands raised or questions in the chat. All right, so I'm not seeing any other hands raised or questions. So I'm just going to thank, I just want to thank Chris and Ricardo again for speaking at the request of Commissioner Houck. We really appreciate you sort of like connecting the dots between the theoretical conversations we're having and then asset safety and sort of boots on the ground, sort of bring us back to the reality of the work that we do and why it's so important. And with that, I think that we will just break for lunch like 10 minutes early and see everyone back at noon. I wanted to call attention to what Jorge put in the chat, which is that there's a global issue with WebEx happening. So if you could stay on the meeting, even if you leave the room, you might have issues rejoining if you leave the meeting and then try to come back on. So hopefully we don't encounter too many issues, but thank you again for sticking with us for the past few hours, and see you back at 1 o'clock. Thank you. So thanks everyone for joining back after lunch. We just have probably about an hour left of this meeting, and we're going to just have, as an overview of the agenda for the last hour, we're going to have a short facilitated discussion with just a couple questions to go over, and then we'll talk about next steps for the proceeding and future public meetings and other work that SPD will plan to release. And then finally, we'll have our closing. So with that, I will move on to the facilitated discussion. So we have just a couple of questions here, and we recognize that this is just sort of getting like initial thoughts on these questions, which will also be released later for written feedback after this meeting. So the first question that we have is, from what we've seen today, we're curious about how utilities think the pure model that was presented on would or would not be compatible with maturity models and frameworks used internally by the IOUs. And then the second question related to our presentation on indicators is, how should the Commission maintain and improve the integrity, veracity, and validity of safety culture indicators that track and monitor improvement within each domain? So we can start with with the first question, maybe if there's anyone that has initial thoughts or feedback that they'd like to provide, or anything that they wanted to add to the discussion. Amanda, thank you. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just figuring out the technology here. So good afternoon, everybody. So I work for PG&E, and typically when we think of maturity models, I don't know exactly the still new. I just was kind of introduced to this yesterday, so I apologize, being a part of the team. So we usually use a 5-step model for our maturity, and to rate our maturity. And then our management system, which was the question that I alluded to earlier, that we're building, is a 13-element management system. And so I don't know, I was looking back through my notes on the PURE framework. I think as long as we understand the framework and we understand the, that's why I asked about the questions behind it, and what we're going to be assessed to, and to get a feel. I think as long as we can overlay that with our 13-element management system, I think we'll be fine. I think we just need to understand more about the PURE model. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. That's helpful. Bob, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I believe during the presentation on the PURE model, were we not told this is the first model of its kind?
It's not the first safety culture maturity model, but I'll pass it over to Dr. Cooper to answer that question.
Hi, Bob. You're right, Emma. It's not the first safety culture maturity model. There's lots of them, but I guess this would be the first with a 3-tiered layer. I've never seen one before. So in that sense, yes, it's the first.
Bob, I think we were, Duncan Hassel here, I think we were also relatively confident that it's the first model that has demonstrated concurrent validity.
Thank you for that. I know that one of the things you had mentioned is you had compacted 30 years of study into a year and a half of work on this model. And I know that you spent some time speaking on the model, and I just wanted to say it's really hard to express sometimes the amount of energy and effort that goes into making something like this. So I wanted to at least raise some appreciation for the time and effort you've put into it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask, Bob, if you, from what you've seen of it and the sight you've had of it and what you've heard, whether you think it's going to be useful or not for you?
It's too early to tell for me. I am also very new to the complexities of a safety culture in its general sense. I've worked for my company for 19 years, and I've seen safety as always the forefront of everyone's mind, and that's what I have deemed as the culture of where I work. That it is the most important thing. So some of the challenges that I see that are raised, it's interesting to see it from that perspective of being somebody that's new to this team because in my opinion, I've always seen my company as been the safest company I've ever worked for or dealt with. So it's a curiosity from my side, but I cannot speak to whether it's better, different, worse than any other model, because this is all new to me personally.
Right. Okay. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I'll pause for just another minute or so, and then we can move on to the next question if there's no more. Oh, I'm sorry, Paul. I just saw your comment in the chat. You can come off mute and ask your question if you'd like.
Just a question. I seem to recall that the concurrent validity was established with respect to something called personal safety, which I guess might be rates of slips, trips, and falls. And was it connected to system incidents and accidents?
Can I answer that?
Please.
Yeah. It was and it wasn't. It's really interesting because in one of them, so we were looking at gas diggings and the numbers, we only had a sample of 5. So anything we get, we can't say is significant. We can't, even though the numbers are high, it's too small a sample for us to really make any determination. When we did it overall, I think I was actually just trying to find the actual numbers, but I think when we did it overall, we got a correlation of 0.3 on 20 sets of data with the process safety overall, which is just outside of significance because it needed to be 0.37. So again, it's just outside, but so we kind of dug in a bit. So we looked at wires down, and when you look at the causes of wires down, Wapa was very good earlier because they were talking about the infrastructure and the integrity, asset reliability, and so on, which is great because that's in their control. But there's a lot that goes on with wires down that's in the public's control. So if you're driving your vehicle and you lose consciousness and you smack into a pole and you bring the pole down, that's the IOUs is out of the IOUs remit. And the same with weather. So we're getting weather extremes and fierce winds and so on and so forth. So that can topple some of the towers or break the lines or whatever, you know, trees can come down across it and whatnot. So there was a lot that's outside of the control. So we tried to split the data by those features, what's within their control and what's not within their. And on one of them, so it was, I'm trying to recollect now, it was doing the inspections of the lines. So it correlated 0.8. So you go, okay, that's great, you know. But again, the validity of the statistics is again about numbers. And it's like, well, okay, it needed to be 0.9. So again, you're just outside. But I guess really what I'm trying to say, Paul, is yes, we looked at it, but the statistics is insufficient numbers to make any kind of real conclusion with it, which is unfortunate. But there are also these things with what's within the IOU's control and what's not in terms of process safety metrics. But that exercise did prompt us to go and look in the academic literature and say, which process safety metrics are linked to safety culture assessments? And it's astonishing to find, I think it was 5, and their suggestions, they're not even really been worked on per se. So Mark talked about a survey, I think at one of these meetings, and he was talking about scrams and so on from the IL NRC work or whatever. And that was a survey that seemed to have a lot of correlations going for it. But then when you looked at the number of correlations, then you get into this thing, well, are they false positives or false negatives? You don't know. There was just so many correlations run that it's, okay, we just don't know. So, but I was fascinated to discover that in terms of process safety, all of these things we do, the broken safety culture features come from looking at process safety going back to the 70s. So one would think there would be some really useful indicators. that there's not. So, and I think Duncan and Rich made the point earlier on that here's an opportunity for the IOUs and the CPUC to lead the way. What are these metrics? Where are they? How do they relate? How can we use these findings to help other utility companies across America and across the globe? You know, hey, look, this seems to work for us, and does it work for you? So we can kind of all cross-validate, as it were, over a period of time. So again, great questions, Paul. I really do think that your questions are very often right on the button, as it were.
Well, your answers are also right on the button. They're very good answers.
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up quickly on Dr. Cooper's comment about an opportunity. And this is one of the things with the low frequency events, is to see if we can identify events that occur more frequently, but less catastrophically, but that we can link to kind of those as indicators of kind of process safety, and then try to find the linkage between those particular safety metrics and safety culture. So there is an opportunity. I think it's a obviously a very large opportunity at this point.
One analog of that, Richard, that I think you might want to consider is it's possible to look at the correlation between some features of safety culture, some dimensions, and indicators of other features to see if, in a sense, there's internal validity or a correspondence between some of the measures and some of the others. It's sort of like a split half test, and that might be useful.
Yeah, can I answer that again, Paul? Because one of the things we built into the report was congruent validity, where we're doing the triangulation. How closely are all of those different measures aligned? How well do they correlate with each other? Is one supporting something else, or are there outliers or whatever? So I think in the report we'd laid out about 12 different types of validity, and you're talking about split half reliability, I think. So you're looking at that end of the scale. But great stuff, and I think these are all different metrics and different lens. You have to look at all of this data across the board. So again, great question.
As long as we're sort of in a mini conversation here, one other question I have is that for Dom, you in particular, there is a pretty important distinction made between accuracy and precision. I have a colleague who does climate modeling and argued that the climate models are now less precise but far more accurate because they deal with more variables, some of which themselves have ranges of uncertainty in the measurements. So I was wondering whether or not in this maturity model you might use ranges of scores as opposed to single value scores to reflect some ambiguities or uncertainties in the measurement process?
Yeah, I mean, we have to, we've been around the block on this as part of the team over the last year and a half. How do you present the data? What kind of data is there? So I guess I put it as ranges in terms of the standard deviation. Well, how do the standard deviations fit with all of this? So it's the same thing. There's a range from here to here or whatever. So there's different ways of presenting the data. And I think in the report, we argued we should present both. We shouldn't just do one. And it's again about how the data, you're using bar graphs, radar graphs, and trend lines, and all sorts of things. So there's a whole suite of different metrics and ways of presenting the data that can be done. And I think, to use Richard's term this morning, to be decided is where we're at. But there are these options. So I think we've covered the bases, but there's some decision making to be made as we go.
And I think I just follow up on that and say I think sort of the ranges and characterizing some of the quantitative data in that way is highly valuable. But I think going back to the previous point about also having qualitative assessment of the assessments is also very important. That's kind of what I think of as the first cut at determining a range, of saying, do you think these assessments are valid? Why or why not? And so I think we're at the point where we've we can allow for some interpretation of the results. We haven't quantified what that interpretation is, but we think that interpretation and sort of the qualitative assessment is important as well.
Thanks, Rich. Amanda, you had your hand raised for a little bit.
That's totally okay. I'm enjoying the conversation. I just had a question on the second bullet there. When we were going through the 10 domain model earlier and we were looking at some of the measures, a couple things that stood out to me were, and I didn't write them down specifically, so bear with me, but it had a little bit to do with the number of field visits, the number of observations, those kind of things, right? And so I think that's fine. I don't know that those measures are going to get us what we are really after from a safety culture standpoint, because anybody can go to the field, anybody can do an observation. There has to be some, I don't know, some maturity even in the visit, right, to get what we're trying to get at here. So that was just one of the items. I think it would be good to get feedback from the utilities on those measures if you're open to that. The other thing that I noticed too is that, you know, having worked in the oil and gas industry for many years, they had very mature systems, very mature management systems, and some of the measures for a very mature organization will look different than they will for maybe a utility or another company that's in the beginning stages of their SMS implementation. So I want to make sure that you know, we get to what we're trying to get to, you know, as a group, and that's really improving the safety culture, you know, within our companies and making sure that we reduce incidents and protect the safety of our people and the public. So, thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Dr. Cooper, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, just to pick up on that, I think you're right. If you have, I mean, I've worked in and around the oil and gas industry for a long time, and where you have companies that are less mature than others, you're going to have different sets of metrics. And I guess that was part of the intuitively why there was a suite of indicators rather than this indicator or that indicator that each IOU would choose that would fit with what it's doing and where it is. And the other one about the field observations and visits, I quite agree. They need to be structured. Shell does some very good structured ones, as I recall. But what I wanted to raise there was one of the reasons that's in there as an indicator. So Terry McSween, I think around the turn of the century, 2001 or whatever it was, published a paper showing that these supervisor visits had a huge impact on reducing injuries. And certainly from where the work that we've been doing in, like, so for example, LNG construction out in the Middle East. And again, you see when you get the leadership going out and it's on a structured basis and there's some meat attached to the bones, as it were, then we were able to see there on 2 years worth of data with 3.5 million observations that the leadership impacted on the guys' safety behavior by approximately 82%. And then when you looked at what the statistics were in terms of the LTIR and so on, at some stages it was 0, but I think it averaged out roughly 0.0 period. So it was quite remarkable, and there was 47,000 third-party nationals on that project. So the metrics are in there, and the metrics originally came from a glean of the academic literature and what measure what does work, what's the studies on safety and so on and so forth, and then with best practice. And Rod, who's not here today, who worked with us, he was Baker Hughes troubleshooter for 30 odd years, going zooming around the world in the oil and gas. So he's got extensive experience also of some of the indicators and the things that really go on. So between us all, we had a lot of experience as safety professionals, as well as academics or whatever in various fields, to lead into this. So I think what I'm trying to say in shorthand is that the indicators are there because they've been shown to impact in some way, shape or form on injury rates. So, thank you.
I have a quick
We can
question.
continue.
Oh yeah,
Go
I
ahead,
was just
Rick.
I'm sorry. I was just wondering if you've heard from all the utilities so far. And
I think just PG&E and SoCal Gas. And I was just going to say, we can move on to thinking about this, continuing to think about this second question, and if there's any initial thoughts on the process for providing feedback and refining the initial set of indicators that we previewed. So we showed just like a very small subset for one particular domain, but there's like a whole suite of indicators, and we're curious to hear if there's any initial thoughts on how those indicators should be refined or just like simply like reworded to be most applicable, both like now and on an ongoing basis, especially in relation to some of those ideas for collaboration that we talked about in the previous working group meeting. So like, are any of the tools that we discussed then opportunities to work on things like developing these indicators? People have any initial thoughts on that? That might be helpful to talk about or to think about after the meeting. Dr. Schulman.
Well, one thing you might want to think about in terms of maybe validity, but also refinement, and that is that the high reliability organizations we looked at in nuclear power and commercial aviation and in air traffic control, they had an interesting approach to this. They started out with the idea of modeling, first off, having an idea of what kind of accidents especially they want to avoid. What are the worst things, the never events? Then they work backwards. Okay, well, what are the physical things that could cause an accident like that? What's the fault tree analysis, et cetera? Then they went back another step. What are the conditions of operation? And they began to get into organizational and management conditions. And then they started to talk about, okay, what can we identify as a set of precursor conditions that make these accidents more likely, and they can start a train of events. And then the question is, how do we keep out of these precursors? What are the elements that would allow us to do that? So then they had a safety model in a sense. What is it that we need to keep us to identify quickly when we're straying into these precursor conditions? Some of them are just organizational, attention demands, loads on control operators, et cetera. And how can we, how are we going to be able to have people call our attention to these things and then start a process by which we either don't enter the precursor zone or we get out of it really fast? And one of the things we saw is those organizations had tremendous, what we call precursor resilience. They were really good at identifying organizational precursors and getting out of it. And that's one of the things that a safety culture can do as well. People become individually responsible for the enactment of the values they have towards safety. There was an assumption that was made in one of the early slides that safety culture is under the control of executives and senior management. Well, I think executives and senior management are necessary elements for a safety culture, but they're not sufficient. And in the organizations we've looked at, people enact the safety culture all over the place. There are leaders. You talk about leadership. People who have leadership roles by leading by example, by enacting the culture in their actual behaviors, which are models for other people. So I think it's possible to imagine that you will think about what indicators, what behavioral indicators do people in operations think really tell them that this is an operation, there's a safety culture in operation here that is really powerful. And so if you have the development of a safety model with precursors, a whole bunch of additional indicators come to mind as possibilities. Things like noise in control rooms and things like that. So I think as part of that metric development and elaboration, it might not be a crazy idea to encourage the utilities to think about this priority of things they want to avoid and the technical lead-ins and also the organizational ones, and then go back to a model of precursor safety and the elements that that may have that could be the raw material from which to develop more indicators.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Dr. Schulman. Dr. Cooper, go ahead.
I just follow that up because I find that really, really interesting. Because when we're looking on the personal injury side with serious injuries and fatalities, there's been a whole movement since with the Mercer Group, who are now attached to National Safety Council since 2012, 2011 perhaps, looking at the precursors of serious injuries and fatalities. So there's a whole lot of companies and organizations across the US who have this precursor profile. So my question was actually to the IOUs, how many of you in the IOUs are actually implementing a formal serious injury and fatality SIF program, potential serious injuries and fatalities and actual program, and how many of you have identified the precursors for them already?
So this is Melvin Brown from Southern California Edison. We actually partnered with Dr. Matt Holloway and the Edison Electric Institute to do a pretty comprehensive study across the industry around SIF precursors. We are actually folding those precursors into how we conduct our observations to ensure that we do have some understanding of where we have at least behavioral exposure before those manifest in in actual incidents, or worse yet, in injuries. Similarly, going back to the previous question, I think around indicators, there's also an EEI effort to actually establish indicators that are consistent across the industry to ensure that we are measuring things and drawing similar conclusions in terms of actions to be taken in a consistent manner as well. So as we think about the veracity, validity, et cetera, I think it does make sense to align with where the industry is going. So we don't have multiple sets of indicators that we are trying to capture. It's very difficult to do so as it is today. So some alignment there, I think, is probably necessary.
Thanks, Melvin. Who did you say was working on the indicators? Sorry, I just missed the group name.
The Edison Electric Institute, EEI.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And I just wanted to follow up on that. I thought that was an interesting comment of creating a set of indicators that are not unique necessarily to one company, but to really the industry as a whole. which kind of goes back to another part of the conversation of, creating some way to have some sort of institute process for sharing information among utilities that might help facilitate that a little bit more concretely, as opposed to simply an ad hoc process. I'm just wondering if parties think there's any value in having some sort of clearinghouse for sharing that sort of information.
This is Melvin with SC again. I absolutely think there's value there. I think when we initially started these working groups, conversations around collaboration and really sharing best practices and learning from each other, I think this is one of the avenues we could leverage to do just that. Again, driving towards a consistent approach. So that makes sense to us.
And thanks, Tom, for your comments in the chat. So if additional feedback on the second question of indicator development and refinement, we can talk about those for a little bit more. And also if you just have any other general feedback on the information that was presented today, we can do that at this time as well.
I do. I'd like to kind of refine the question a little bit and think about the indicators from the context of each domain. And I'm wondering what the parties and the IOUs think about structuring indicators from the context of the 10 domains that have been proposed in the pure model. Specifically, so if you think about some indicator that goes to safety communication, or within that domain, or indicators that might be focused on strategy, or so just wondering if people have any thoughts on the usefulness of structuring kind of these indicators from that perspective of each domain.
We would, like to discuss it internally. We just appreciate everything today and we need to digest and spend some time.
Thanks, Tom. Amanda?
Hey, everybody. So I think for us, we're right in, we're in the beginning state, not the beginning, but we're in the stages of developing and implementing our safety management system. And it's based on, ISO 55001, 45001, and API 1173, and the requirements that are in there. When I learned about the INPO 10, which was recently, I think what I learned today is that a lot of what we're developing is aligned. I can't say all, right, because I don't know it by heart, but a lot of what you all are proposing is in alignment with what we're doing from a management system standpoint. So I think for us, it's just making sure that the measurements make sense and that we continue along our implementation, operationalization, and sustainment, which is a forever process when you implement a management system. So yeah, I think it's appreciate the opportunity to sit in today and learn to the different, listen to the different presentations and learn more about what we're trying to accomplish. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. All right. So we will just do one final call to see if people have responses to the question that Rich asked about indicators within each of the 10 domains, or just any other general questions or comments before we move on to talking about next steps. All right, I'll go ahead and move on, but if you think of something, feel free to raise your hand and I will stop. So I'm just going to provide a quick overview of our next steps. So as you may have seen, there was a ruling issued last week to solicit feedback on the information that was presented in the first 2 technical working group meetings. And so those comments will be due on August 15th and reply comments will be due on August 29th. Following this meeting, we'll also solicit written feedback on topics that were discussed in the 3rd and 4th working group meetings. And then SPD has the goal of basically reviewing and synthesizing that feedback to discuss at an all-party meeting to conclude these technical working group meetings. So that at the all-party meeting, which we anticipate would be in early fall, so likely September, we would debrief the information that was discussed at the technical working group meetings to date, review and sort of summarize the feedback that we've received from the written comments. And then if there's additional issues that we need to discuss, then we would provide a venue for providing additional input on scoping memo questions, and also we would discuss our next steps, anticipated next steps for developing the staff proposal. And then after the all-party meeting, we would hope to release both the draft staff proposal and the full maturity model, which we would then, after allowing people time to review those documents, have a final workshop in fall of 2022 to go over those documents and have a venue to discuss them in public. So do people have any questions about that process? And I'll also write this in, or we'll write this in like emails to be more specific about this anticipated timeline. All right, so with that, I think I will pass it on to Commissioner Houck for closing remarks.
I just wanted to thank everyone for the discussion and the excellent questions. It gives us a lot to think about as we move forward, and I'm looking forward to working with all of the parties and our staff and consultants as we address our safety culture assessment program and process. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Emma.
Thanks, Commissioner Houck. And I'll pause again for questions just before we go. hopefully you have my email sessions after, and you can feel free to send SBD those questions, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And I'm not seeing any questions, so just wanted to thank everyone again for taking the time to attend this working group meeting and the other working group meetings this summer. And we will follow up with next steps for providing feedback in the upcoming meetings as we schedule them. So thank you again, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Emma and Richard.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Emma.
Thank you, Dr. Shulman.
Thank you, Dom.
Take care.